They vanished around 50,000 years ago, leaving behind no cities, no written record, and almost no recognizable faces in the fossil record. For most of human history, we did not even know they existed, and yet, in one of the strangest discoveries modern science has ever made, part of them is still here, hidden inside living human DNA. Tonight, we follow the ghostly trail of the Denisovans, a lost branch of humanity that disappeared from the Earth, but never fully left us. Before we go deeper, please like the video, subscribe to the channel, and join me for this journey into one of the most unsettling mysteries of the human past. In a cave in southern Siberia, beneath layers of cold earth and the ash of vanished fires, a few broken fragments wait in the dark for tens of thousands of years. They are so slight that, at first glance, they barely seem worthy of attention. A piece of finger bone no larger than a scrap, a great molar with an oddly ancient heft, splinters of a past too damaged to tell their own story. There is no preserved face beside them, no complete skeleton laid out in the old dramatic style, no towering burial chamber, no written memory, no legend that remembers a people once living in the mountains and forests of Ice Age Asia. There is almost nothing. And yet, from these scraps comes one of the strangest discoveries in the history of human origins, a whole population of human relatives, unknown to science, gone for perhaps 50,000 years, but not entirely gone at all. Because the first shock is not that they existed. The Ice Age world is crowded enough already with ghosts. Neanderthals are known, early modern humans are known, other older human species haunt the deeper background. What makes this story unsettling is the second revelation, the one that changes the feeling of extinction itself. These people did not simply vanish into the long silence of prehistory. Part of them remains, carried invisibly in the cells of living human beings. Their bodies disappeared, their languages vanished, their camps decayed, their bones were mostly lost to time, but fragments of their inheritance endured the way embers can survive inside ash. The evidence is not carved in stone or painted on a cave wall. It is inside us. That idea still has the power to feel almost improper, as though the boundary between the living and the extinct has been disturbed. It is easy, in the modern imagination, to picture human evolution as a neat procession, one species after another, one replacing the last, a clear line moving steadily forward until it becomes us. The deeper record has been dismantling that picture for years, but few discoveries have done it as completely as this one. The ancient world now looks less like a line and more like a weather system fronts colliding, populations separating and meeting again, branches dividing and rejoining, some groups fading, others enduring, all of them moving through landscapes that change faster than memory could ever hold. In that unstable world, extinction is not always a clean ending. Sometimes it leaves traces that do not look like ruins. Sometimes it leaves blood. Imagine Eurasia during the late Ice Age and just before it. Vast cold steppes stretch under hard skies. Forests advance and retreat with the climate. Glaciers lock up water and then loosen their grip. Herds move across the land bison, horse, mammoth, deer. Rivers cut through valleys that have seen many kinds of people come and go. Somewhere in this immense geography, beyond the reach of any written history, a human population emerges from an older branch of the family tree. They are not modern humans, though in some ways they are near kin. They are not Neanderthals, though they are related to them too. They're something else, a sister lineage lost so completely that science will not even suspect them until the 21st century. No ancient historian gives them a name. No surviving tradition describes them. For tens of thousands of years, they pass through the earth almost anonymously. And then modern science, with its strange ability to summon entire vanished worlds from chemical residue, begins to notice that something does not fit. The old bones of human relatives had long been studied by shape, skull size, brow ridges, jaw form, limb proportions, tooth structure. These were the grammar of paleoanthropology, and for good reason. Bone is what survives. Bone is what can be held. Bone gives history a body. But by the opening years of the new century, another kind of evidence is becoming powerful enough to challenge the old order. Ancient DNA, once a fragile and doubtful frontier, starts to deliver results that would have sounded impossible not long before. It can recover ancestry from remains so meagre that traditional anatomy can barely classify them. It can reveal kinship where the eye sees only fragments. It can expose entire populations that left almost no recognizable skeletons behind. Before we go deeper, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, if this is the kind of history and mystery you enjoy, because this mystery does not begin with a grand monument or a famous lost city. It begins with an insult to intuition. How can science identify a people from a finger bone? How can a vanished lineage be recognized before its face is known? How can the dead announce themselves not through architecture, not through art, not through a complete body, but through a molecular pattern hidden in the dust of a cave, and stranger still? How can that pattern appear again, not only in ancient remains, but in living populations scattered across Asia and the Pacific, as though the extinct had never fully agreed to leave? The answer begins with a shift in what counts as evidence. For generations, prehistory was reconstructed from objects and anatomy, from stone tools, campsites, butchered animal bone, burial practice, and the scattered shapes of fossil remains. Those methods still matter. Nothing replaces the physical world. But genetics adds another layer, one that can sometimes reach beyond the limits of the visible. It can tell us that two bones found far apart belong to related populations. It can reveal whether different human groups met and had children. It can show that some ancestry survives only in diluted form, carried forward through descendants who no longer resemble the group from which that ancestry came. What survives in the record suggests that the human past is full of such encounters, most of them forgotten the moment the people involved died. DNA remembers what culture may not. That is why the Denisovan story lands with such force. It is not only a discovery about one lost population, it is a discovery about how little the old map contained. The landmass of Asia, especially, begins to look less like a stage visited by a few familiar characters and more like a deep archive of human diversity. There are caves not yet excavated, bones not yet tested, sediments holding genetic traces from individuals whose remains may never be found intact. Scholars still debate the exact size, range, and internal diversity of the Denisovan population, and the evidence remains incomplete. But even the broadest outline is enough to change the mood of human origins. For a long time, extinction seemed to mean final absence. Now it can also mean persistence by inheritance. The emotional force of that realization is easy to underestimate. Most extinct animals are gone in the ordinary sense. The mammoth does not continue in the bodies of elephants. The trilobite is not present in hidden fragments beneath the skin of some living arthropod. But humans are different because humans met one another. Closely related groups overlapped, competed, avoided one another, exchanged skills, and sometimes shared children. The result is that disappearance becomes harder to define. When a distinct population loses its separate identity, when its numbers dwindle, when its language and customs are absorbed or erased, when its bones stop appearing in the record, is that extinction? In one sense, clearly yes. In another, the answer blurs. Denisovans as a people are gone. Denisovan ancestry is not. Both statements are true at the same time. That paradox is part of what makes them so compelling. They feel both intimate and unreachable. Neanderthals, however fragmentary, have faces reconstructed in museums. Their bodies can be imagined with some confidence. Their geographic range is broad but tangible. Denisovans are more elusive. Their presence first becomes visible not in a reconstructed skeleton but in data. They arrive in science almost as a signal from the dark. Only later do scattered clues begin to gather round that signal: a cave here, a jawbone there, a tooth, a trace of genetic adaptation in people living today, a hint that this lost lineage once occupied not one corner of Eurasia, but a vast territory of mountains, plateaus, forests, and perhaps tropical islands. The picture is still incomplete enough to be unsettling. It is as though we know their after effects before we know them, and that after effect is written into living bodies in uneven, revealing ways. Some modern populations carry more Denisovan ancestry than others. Some inherited versions of genes that appear to have been useful in harsh environments. One of the most striking cases points toward high-altitude adaptation in Tibet, where a Denisovan-derived genetic variant helps human bodies manage thin air. Here the past stops being abstract. A vanished lineage does not merely survive as a curiosity in a laboratory chart. It may have helped living people endure one of the most demanding habitats on Earth. The dead, in a very real sense, contribute to the survival of the living. No single explanation fully accounts for every Denisovan-derived trait found in modern populations, and scientists remain cautious about overstating what genes can tell us about identity or destiny. But the broad fact remains astonishing. Ancient encounters change the biological future of our species. There is a temptation, when faced with this kind of story, to turn Denisovans into something mystical, a secret race hidden behind the edges of known history, half seen and romanticized because so little of them remains. That temptation should be resisted. They were not myth. They were human relatives shaped by ordinary realities of hunger, climate, movement, danger, and kinship. They lived in landscapes that could kill the careless and reward the adaptable. They made their way through a world of cold phases and warmer intervals, of predators, of shifting prey, of rival human groups. They probably raised children, watched the weather, knew particular routes, remembered safe places, feared injury, and depended on one another in ways that no fossil can fully preserve. The mystery around them comes not from magic, but from loss. So much has vanished that what remains glows with unusual intensity. And perhaps that is the deeper reason the Denisovan story lingers in the imagination. It offers a humbling correction. Modern humans are accustomed to treating themselves as singular, isolated, the only surviving version of humanity. Yet the deeper past suggests a very different scene. We are the remaining strand of a much denser braid. Around us, behind us, within us. There were others. Some lasted for immense spans of time and then disappeared. Some met us briefly and left only the faintest material trace. Some may still be almost entirely unknown. The old world was full of human forms, close enough to us to interbreed, distant enough to remain separate, each carrying its own history through climates and continents that have since changed beyond recognition. So the story opens not with certainty, but with a residue, a cave, a fragment, a genome, a realization that one of the lost branches of humanity is not only recoverable, but present, quietly carried forward in the descendants of people who no longer remember the meetings that made that inheritance possible. They vanished roughly 50,000 years ago, perhaps earlier in some places and later in others. The dates and circumstances remain under debate. Their camps are gone. Their voices are gone. Their names are gone. But in the long arithmetic of survival, disappearance was not the end of them. A part of their story crossed the threshold into us and waited there, hidden, until science learned how to listen. The place that gives them their modern name does not look like the birthplace of a revolution in human history. Denisova Cave lies in the Altai Mountains of southern Siberia, in a landscape of river valleys, forests, and long winters, a place where cold air settles hard and the seasons can still feel more powerful than the human presence around them. It is not a spectacular ruin. No carved pillars rise from the ground. No shattered city walls tell the passerby that some forgotten civilization once stood here. It is, instead, the kind of place archaeologists learn to respect precisely because it seems unassuming, a shelter that has drawn living beings back again and again across immense stretches of time. Predators used it. Humans used it. Sediments accumulated slowly, layer over layer, preserving the kind of quiet record that only caves can sometimes keep. By the time scientists begin seriously studying the site, Denisova Cave is already known as archaeologically important. Excavations reveal a long sequence of occupations stretching through different climatic periods and different phases of prehistory. Stone tools appear, animal remains appear, evidence of fires appears. The cave has the feeling of a deep archive, one of those rare sites where time has not been erased so much as compressed. What makes caves like this so valuable is not that they preserve everything. They do not. They preserve selectively, often frustratingly. But now and then they keep exactly the thing the future will need most, without anyone recognizing its importance until much later. In 2008, among the excavated material from Denisova Cave, a small bone fragment emerges from a layer associated broadly with the late Pleistocene. It is tiny, so slight that it could easily have passed as one more ambiguous scrap among thousands. Morphologically, it offers little drama. It appears to be part of a finger bone from a juvenile individual. On shape alone, it does not announce an entirely new population of humans. That is part of what makes the story so remarkable. For most of the history of paleoanthropology, a fragment like this would have remained limited by its own modesty. It could be described, classified provisionally, compared, perhaps published as a minor find. But by the early 21st century, the field has acquired a new instrument, and the fragment is about to become far more talkative than its size suggests. Ancient DNA analysis had already begun to transform the study of the human past, though it still carried difficulties and risks. DNA degrades over time. It is easily contaminated. The older and warmer the environment, the worse the preservation usually becomes. Caves in cold regions offer unusual advantages, and Denisova Cave, with its low temperatures and relatively favourable conditions, turns out to have preserved genetic material exceptionally well. When researchers extract DNA from the little finger bone, they are not expecting to rewrite the map of human evolution quite so completely. At first, the task is narrower, determines what this individual might reveal about known human populations of the late Pleistocene. But the genome that emerges does not fit the expected categories. It is not modern human in any simple sense. It is not Neanderthal either, though it is closer to Neanderthals than to us in some respects. Instead, it points to a distinct lineage, one that shares a common ancestry with Neanderthals, but branches away from them deeply enough to represent something separate. Here, suddenly, from a child's finger bone, a new population steps into view. The scientific world does not receive a dramatic skeleton laid out on a table. It receives a genetic signal, a lineage first identified not by face or stature, but by sequence. The old logic of discovery is reversed. Usually, bone comes first and DNA confirms it later. Here, DNA arrives first and tells science that it has been looking at an unknown kind of human all along. That is the moment the cave changes. Denisova Cave becomes not merely an important Paleolithic site, but the type locality for an entire human group that no one had recognized before. The name Denisovan follows naturally, derived from the cave itself, which had already taken its name from a Russian hermit, Denis, said to have lived there centuries ago. It is a curious chain of naming a vanished population known from a cave, the cave known from a hermit, the hermit now lending his name, indirectly, to people who lived tens of thousands of years before him. There is a certain irony in that. One of humanity's great lost branches enters modern knowledge under a label that tells us almost nothing about how they described themselves, what language they spoke, or what they called the world around them. The name is useful. It is also a reminder of how much has been lost. The first Denisovan genome causes immediate excitement not simply because it reveals a new group, but because it reveals how much the record has failed to show through fossils alone. A whole lineage of humans had gone unrecognized because the bones available were too few, too fragmentary, or too difficult to assign. Scholars had long known that the fossil record was incomplete. But this is incompleteness of a particularly humbling kind. It suggests that the human past contains populations that may have left almost no anatomically obvious trace, or left traces that sit quietly in museum drawers under uncertain labels. The evidence remains incomplete even now, but what survives in the record suggests that Denisovans are not an isolated oddity. They are a warning about how much of prehistory may still be hidden behind absence. Then the cave yields another clue, and it is one of the strange pleasures of this story that each clue seems to arrive in a different form. A large molar tooth discovered in Denisova Cave draws attention because of its size and robust character. It does not resemble the teeth of recent modern humans, and in some respects it looks surprisingly archaic. Later, additional teeth and fragments reinforce the impression that the cave's mysterious inhabitants were not a one-off anomaly, represented by a single child. There were others, yet the paradox deepens. The more important Denisovans become, the less visually graspable they seem. A cave rich in significance remains poor in complete human remains. No full Denisovan skull appears to settle the matter. No elegant reconstruction emerges immediately from the earth. Instead, the population has to be assembled out of pieces, and each piece says something different. Stone tools and symbolic artifacts from Denisova Cave complicate the picture further. Some layers of the site contain sophisticated objects, including ornaments such as beads and a polished stone bracelet that drew wide attention because of its apparent craftsmanship and age. For a time, these finds fed speculation about which human group in the cave had made what. Were Denisovans responsible for certain advanced artifacts? Were Neanderthals, were modern humans present in some layers? The answer is not always straightforward. Caves with long occupation histories are rarely simple. Layers may be disturbed. Different groups may have visited at different times. Artifacts do not come labelled with their maker. Scholars still debate aspects of the cave's chronology and cultural attribution, and no single explanation fully accounts for every association between human remains and material culture at the site. That uncertainty matters. It prevents the story from hardening too quickly into false clarity. Still, some of the broad outlines remain secure. Denisova Cave was not a brief stop but a place revisited across long spans of time. It hosted multiple hominin populations, including Neanderthals and Denisovans, and perhaps others at different moments. It sat within a region that seems to have acted as both refuge and corridor, where populations could persist, meet, overlap, and separate again as climates shifted. The cave was not a stage for one static community, but a recurring point in a mobile and changing human landscape. This helps explain why it matters so much. It is not only where Denisovans were recognized, it is a site where the tangled nature of the human past becomes unusually visible. One of the most startling discoveries linked to Denisova Cave drives that point home with almost uncomfortable force. Among the remains found there is a bone fragment from a young female individual whose genome reveals that she had a Neanderthal mother and a Denisovan father. This is not evidence of distant ancient gene flow blurred across millennia. It is evidence of a first-generation hybrid, the direct child of parents from two distinct human groups. The find is extraordinary because it collapses abstraction into intimacy. It is one thing to say that populations interbred. It is another to hold evidence that one individual carried both lineages so immediately. The cave does not merely testify that these groups coexisted in some distant, statistical sense. It preserves the biological proof that they met at the level of family. That single individual, sometimes informally nicknamed Denny in popular reporting, does more than confirm interbreeding. She changes the emotional temperature of the whole story. The Ice Age world becomes less like a museum of separate species and more like a human landscape full of contact zones, borderlands, and unstable identities. The categories used by modern science remain useful, but life in the past may have been much messier than those labels suggest. A Denisovan and a Neanderthal do not merely occupy adjacent pages in a classification scheme. At least once, and surely more than once, they shared a child. The discovery is not evidence that distinctions did not matter. It is evidence that distinctions did not prevent contact. All of this emerges from a cave whose physical modesty seems almost to mock the scale of its implications. Denisova Cave does not tell its story easily. It offers no panoramic certainty, only accumulations of sediment, fragments, dates, sequences, and associations that must be interpreted with care. But that is true of much of deep prehistory. The record is rarely generous. It gives partial access, never the full scene. What makes Denisova Cave exceptional is that its fragments happen to intersect with a scientific moment capable of hearing them in a new way. Had the finger bone been found a century earlier, it might have gone almost unnoticed. Had the cave's preservation been poorer, the DNA might not have survived. Had excavation been less careful, key remains might have been lost in the spoil. Discovery depends not only on what the past leaves behind, but on whether the present has learned how to see it. There is, too, a broader lesson in the cave's silence. For generations, the human story was written around the most visible things skulls dramatic enough to publish, tools distinctive enough to define cultures, sights spectacular enough to command attention. Denisova Cave reminds us that enormous truths can wait inside the nearly invisible. A finger bone no larger than a child's knuckle can contain the evidence for an entire forgotten population. A tooth can imply a body no one has fully reconstructed. A cave floor can hold traces of meetings, mating, and migration that no memory survives to describe. The past is not obliged to leave obvious evidence. Sometimes it leaves only what future methods can rescue. And so the Denisovans first enter our world not as a people fully seen, but as a presence inferred from a cave and its patient archive. Their name comes from Denisova. Their discovery comes from genetics. Their reality is then strengthened by teeth, fragments, sediments, and the remarkable hybrid child who proves that these were not isolated branches moving in parallel, but human groups whose lives touched directly. The cave does not answer every question. Far from it. It opens more than it closes. But once Denisova Cave has spoken, the old certainty is gone. Humanity's past is larger, stranger, and more crowded than it seemed. Somewhere beyond the cave mouth, across the mountains and plains of ancient Asia, there must have been entire populations belonging to this lineage, living lives now almost wholly erased. The cave gives them a name. It does not yet give them a world. That wider world is what begins to emerge next. Long before anyone could name Denisovans, before caves became archives and genomes became witnesses, the world that shaped them was already in motion. Nothing about Ice Age Eurasia is stable for very long. Forest gives way to grassland, then advances again. Cold deepens, retreats, and deepens once more. Glaciers swell across the north, locking away water and pressing climate belts southward. Winds move dust over immense distances. Rivers change their courses. Animal herds follow the shifting edges between open country and woodland. In one age, a valley is a corridor of movement. In another, it becomes a barrier of snow, mud, or ice. For any human population trying to survive across hundreds of thousands of years, the first fact of existence is change. This is the world Denisovans inherit, not a fixed homeland, but a restless continent stretching from the Altai Mountains to lands still only dimly visible in the record, perhaps across the Tibetan Plateau, perhaps into Eastern Asia, perhaps farther south into warmer zones that preserve bone poorly and keep their secrets well. It is a world of enormous ecological variety. To imagine them properly, it is not enough to picture one cave in Siberia. Their story, even in its fragmentary form, belongs to forests of birch and pine, to cold steppe under pale skies, to rocky uplands where breath shortens in thin air, to river systems rich with seasonal opportunity, and perhaps to subtropical landscapes where dense vegetation and heat erase ancient traces almost as quickly as they are left behind. The evidence remains incomplete, but what survives in the record suggests that Denisovans were shaped by a broad and demanding range of environments. The late Middle Pleistocene and Late Pleistocene, the long ages during which Denisovan populations likely existed, are defined by climatic swings of extraordinary scale. These are not minor weather fluctuations, not even the sort of century-to-century change that can trouble historical civilizations. They are profound reorganizations of the living world. During colder phases, ice sheets spread and sea levels fall, exposing land bridges and opening routes across spaces that later disappear beneath water. During warmer intervals, forests expand into regions that had been open grassland, and animal communities reorganize accordingly. A hunting population cannot ignore such changes. Food sources shift, migration paths alter. Shelters that once lay near rich resources become less useful. Distances between habitable zones can widen or narrow within a few thousand years, which in deep time is both slow and brutally fast. The animals of Denisovan Eurasia help reveal the scale of that world. Woolly mammoths move across cold grasslands. Woolly rhinoceroses graze where vegetation allows. Steppe bison, wild horses, red deer, ibex, and other ungulates populate different ecological belts. Carnivores remain a constant threat and a constant competitor. Cave lions, wolves, hyenas in some regions, bears occupying shelters that humans might also seek. These are not decorative animals in the background of a human drama. They define the stakes. To live in such a world is to read movement constantly: hoofprints, weather fronts, seasonal timing, danger in tree cover, opportunity at river crossings, carcasses that can be scavenged, predators that must be avoided. Human survival here depends not on mastering nature in the modern sense, but on learning how to remain inside its rhythms without being broken by them. There is a tendency to imagine prehistoric life as uniformly primitive, as though all ancient humans inhabited the same bleak simplicity. The real picture is harder and more intelligent than that. Any population surviving repeatedly through Pleistocene climate swings must be flexible. It must know when to move and when to stay. It must know particular landscapes in detail, not abstractly but bodily. The way one knows where snow drifts deepest, where animals bottleneck, where fresh water persists in hard seasons, where stones suitable for tools can be found, where exposure to wind becomes dangerous after dusk. Denisovans, whatever precise cultural traditions they practiced, must have possessed this kind of environmental intelligence. No lineage persists across changing Ice Age Asia by accident. The Altai region itself offers a useful starting point because it shows why such places matter. Mountain systems create ecological mosaics. Elevation changes conditions quickly. Valleys shelter trees and water. Slopes produce different plant communities depending on aspect and season. Caves provide refuge, storage of cold, and repeated points of return. Regions like this can serve as refugia during harsher climatic phases, pockets where life remains possible while surrounding zones become less hospitable. They can also serve as meeting grounds, where populations moving along different corridors intersect. Denisova Cave's importance may owe something to exactly this quality. It sits not in a dead end, but in a zone of movement and survival, a landscape capable of holding life through instability. Yet the Denisovan world extends beyond Siberia in all likelihood, and once the imagination follows them outward, the scale becomes immense. Consider the Tibetan Plateau, one of the most severe inhabited regions on Earth, with its cold, aridity, and low oxygen. Genetic evidence in modern Tibetans later suggests a Denisovan connection to high-altitude adaptation, and a jawbone from Baishia Karst Cave on the northeastern edge of the plateau has been identified through protein evidence as Denisovan. This does not mean every Denisovan population lived on the plateau, nor does it settle every detail of their distribution. Scholars still debate chronology, movement, and regional diversity, but it strongly suggests that at least some Denisovans were capable of surviving in environments that would challenge many human groups even today. Their world is not merely broad, it includes edges where life becomes physiologically difficult. Then there are the lower and perhaps warmer zones, the lands of Eastern and Southeastern Asia, where fossil preservation is often poor, and where ancient DNA rarely survives long in the heat. Here the silence of the record can be misleading. Absence of evidence does not mean absence of people. Some of the strongest Denisovan ancestry in living populations appears far from Siberia, especially among Papuan and Aboriginal Australian populations and in parts of island Southeast Asia, implying ancient encounters somewhere in Asia between Denisovan-related groups and the modern humans moving through these regions. The exact settings of those encounters remain uncertain. No single explanation fully accounts for all the patterns in the data. There may even have been more than one Denisovan-like population highly diverse across space. But the implication is clear enough: the human map of ancient Asia was far more populated and complex than the surviving fossils alone would suggest. Climate helps explain why that complexity endures so poorly in the record. Cold caves preserve, open-air camps vanish, humid forests digest bone, coasts drown when sea levels rise. Entire landscapes that may once have carried human traffic lie underwater today, especially around Southeast Asia, where lowered sea levels during glacial periods exposed larger land masses and altered migration routes. Modern shorelines are not ancient shorelines. Some of the places where Denisovans or Denisovan-related populations may have lived are now submerged or destroyed or buried beyond easy reach. This is one reason the story feels at once immense and fragmented. We are trying to reconstruct a continental drama from patches of surviving ground. The world Denisovans inherit is also crowded with other humans. This matters deeply. They do not live in an empty stage awaiting Homo sapiens. Neanderthals occupy Western Eurasia and extend eastward into regions close enough for overlap. Other older human lineages may persist in some places, though the evidence is often disputed or difficult to classify. Later, modern humans spread across the same broad zones, bringing new pressures, new contacts, and new possibilities for exchange. In such a setting, climate does not just shape habitats, it shapes encounters. When colder conditions compress populations into refugia, different groups may be forced nearer to one another. When warmer phases open new corridors, populations can expand, fragment, and meet again under new terms. The geography of contact is never fixed. Even the sky would have been different in ways that matter. A world of colder phases carries different seasonal stress, different storm tracks, different vegetation coverage affecting animal movement and fire ecology. In northern latitudes, the winter darkness lengthens, not as metaphor but as practical difficulty. Fuel matters, shelter matters, knowledge matters. A group able to time movements well, share resources effectively, and maintain social bonds across harsh cycles gains an advantage not visible in a fossil tooth. Prehistoric survival is often romanticized into feats of toughness, but endurance depends at least as much on memory, cooperation, and timing. Denisovans must have possessed these qualities in some durable form. The bare fact that they persisted long enough to spread widely and leave descendants among later humans is itself evidence of competence. There is another important feature of their inherited world: isolation and connection exist side by side. Mountain chains separate valleys, but they also guide movement. Rivers divide landscapes, but they also create routes. Harsh environments can fragment populations into local groups with distinctive traits, while periodic climatic shifts reconnect those groups through new corridors. Over very long spans, this process can generate diversity within a lineage. Some scientists suspect Denisovans may not have been one uniform population at all, but a broad and regionally varied set of groups sharing deep ancestry. The genetic hints are suggestive, though far from complete. If true, then the Denisovan world is not the territory of a single people marching under one identity, but a patchwork of related populations adapted to local conditions, occasionally linked, occasionally isolated, and difficult now to disentangle. That possibility makes their disappearance more haunting, because it suggests that what vanished was not a single tribe or even a single culture, but a whole branch of human diversity spread across ecologies and distances large enough to rival continents of later history. Some Denisovan groups may have endured in cold northern habitats, others may have persisted in uplands, others may have interacted with incoming modern humans in eastern or southeastern Asia. Their endings need not have been simultaneous. One population may have faded early, another much later. Some may have been replaced, others absorbed. The record is too broken to narrate any final curtain with confidence. But the larger world they inhabited makes one thing clear: extinction in deep time is usually not one event. It is a drawn-out thinning across landscapes. To picture Denisovans in this inherited world, then, is to set them inside motion rather than stillness. They move under changing skies. They return to good shelters and abandon others. They read the migrations of animals and the hazards of terrain. They adapt to places that range from cold mountain valleys to oxygen-poor plateaus, and perhaps to regions much warmer and less archaeologically forgiving. They live among predators and among other humans. Their children grow up in a world where familiarity and danger are both written into the land. Firelight flickers against cave walls. Winds move over grasslands where hoofbeats travel before the animals can be seen. Snow closes routes that had seemed open a season earlier. Somewhere, over thousands of years, populations split and reunite, meet strangers, carry skills, lose them, remember paths, forget old territories, survive another winter. This is the stage on which the Denisovan story unfolds, and it matters because it strips away the temptation to view them as a static mystery, sealed inside one Siberian cave. Denisova Cave is only the doorway through which we first notice them. The real Denisovan world is larger, harsher, and far more dynamic. It is a world where endurance requires adaptation at every level, bodily, ecological, and social. It is also a world in which human lineages do not remain neatly apart. Climate, geography, and movement are always rearranging the conditions of life. By the time our own species enters more deeply into these same landscapes, the ground is already full of older histories. Denisovans are part of that inheritance, one of the human presences shaped by Ice Age Asia long before modern memory begins. To understand them, it is not enough to know where they were found. It is necessary to know the world that made them possible. By the time Denisovans enter the scientific record, they arrive already burdened with comparison. Almost immediately, they are described in relation to someone else. They are introduced as cousins of Neanderthals, as a sister lineage, as another branch beside the better-known populations of the human story. This is accurate as far as it goes, but it can also be misleading, because it makes Denisovan sound secondary, as though they are defined mainly by nearness to a more famous group. The deeper truth is more interesting. Denisovans are not simply an appendix to the Neanderthal story. They represent a major lineage of humanity in their own right, one whose ancestry reaches back into the same deep and unsettled evolutionary past that produced us, Neanderthals, and perhaps other populations still only dimly understood. To understand where they fit, it helps to step away from the old image of human evolution as a ladder. Ladders encourage the wrong instincts. They suggest progress in a single direction, a clear ascent from primitive to advanced, from earlier to later, from less human to more human. The actual pattern is branching, merging, and branching again. Different human populations separate from common ancestors, adapt in different landscapes, change over long spans of time, and sometimes come back into contact. They do not line up neatly in order of importance. They form a family tree, though even tree is perhaps too tidy a metaphor. The deeper past often looks less like a tree than a thicket. Somewhere in that thicket lies the shared ancestry of modern humans, Neanderthals and Denisovans. The broad outline, according to mainstream scientific understanding, is that the lineage leading to modern humans split from the lineage leading to Neanderthals and Denisovans several 100,000 years ago, likely more than 500,000 years in the past. Later, the ancestors of Neanderthals and Denisovans split from one another as well. Exact dates vary depending on the methods used and the evidence considered, and scholars still debate the timing and complexity of these divergences, but the overall pattern is clear enough. Denisovans and Neanderthals share a more recent common ancestry with each other than either does with us. That closeness matters. It explains why they could interbreed not only with modern humans, but with one another. Yet close kinship should not be mistaken for sameness. Two lineages can share ancestry and still become distinct over time, especially when separated across different geographies and ecological pressures. Neanderthals are best known from Western Eurasia and parts of Western and Central Asia. Denisovans seem to have been more strongly associated with Asia farther east, though the edges of their ranges almost certainly shifted, blurred, and overlapped across time. If Neanderthals are the better-known western branch of this shared ancestry, Denisovans may represent an eastern counterpart, though even that simplification risks hiding internal diversity. What survives in the record suggests that both lineages were dynamic, mobile and regionally varied, not fixed human types moving unchanged through thousands of generations. The older fossils that might illuminate the roots of Denisovans remain frustratingly difficult to classify. This is one reason the lineage still feels partly submerged. When paleoanthropologists look back into the Middle Pleistocene, they encounter a landscape of human remains that often resist clean labelling. There are fossils from places like China and elsewhere in Asia that have at times been linked, speculatively or cautiously, to Denisovans or to populations ancestral to them. Some researchers have wondered whether certain enigmatic Asian fossils, difficult to place within familiar categories, may belong somewhere near the Denisovan branch. Others remain more cautious, and for good reason. Fossils can share traits for many reasons, and without direct genetic evidence or clearer anatomical association, it is dangerous to force the record into neat boxes. The evidence remains incomplete, and no single fossil has yet emerged as the universally accepted face of Denisovan ancestry. This uncertainty does not weaken the Denisovan story so much as deepen it. It reminds us that the names used today are often handles attached to much larger biological histories. Denisovan is a modern label applied after the fact, based initially on genetic evidence from one cave and then supported by scattered finds elsewhere. But the actual lineage almost certainly stretches back through populations that did not know themselves by any such category. Somewhere before the Denisovans recognizable in the genetic record, there are ancestral groups moving through Eurasia, adapting, diversifying, and splitting away from related populations. Some of those ancestors may have left fossils already known to science but not securely identified. Others may never be found. The family tree exists, but some of its most important branches are still hidden in fog. There is also the question of just how distinct Denisovans were internally. Early accounts naturally treated them as a single group because the evidence was so limited. But as genetic work has expanded, some scientists have suggested that Denisovan ancestry in living populations may not come from one uniform source. Instead, there may have been multiple Denisovan-related populations spread across Asia, different enough from one another that they left distinguishable signals in the genomes of later humans. If that is true, the word Denisovan may describe not a single tightly bounded people, but a wider family of related populations. This would make them less like a solitary branch and more like a cluster of branches within an eastern human radiation. Scholars still debate this possibility, but it would help explain why their traces appear in such varied places and why the genetic story sometimes seems more complex than the fossil evidence alone would predict. The relationship between Denisovans and Neanderthals is especially revealing because it shows how misleading rigid species thinking can be when applied too mechanically to the human past. Modern biology often expects species boundaries to act as strong barriers. In the Pleistocene human world, those boundaries appear more permeable. Denisovans and Neanderthals were distinct lineages, yes, but not so distinct that they could not produce offspring together. The hybrid individual found at Denisova Cave makes that undeniable. This does not erase the differences between them. It shows that evolutionary separation in this case was incomplete. They had diverged, but not to the point of total reproductive isolation. The same is true, in a separate way, for Denisovans and modern humans. Whatever labels are used, they were close enough kin to leave descendants. That fact has profound implications for how the human family is imagined. It means the ancient world was not occupied by sealed boxes called species moving in parallel without contact. It was occupied by populations with histories of separation and reunion. Some had been apart long enough to acquire distinct traits, perhaps distinct appearances, perhaps distinct behaviours or ecological preferences. But when they met, the result was not always conflict or exclusion. Sometimes it was gene flow. Sometimes it was a child. Sometimes it was a genetic inheritance that would later spread through other populations and survive long after the parent group disappeared. The old urge to sort ancient humans into isolated kinds begins to break down under this evidence. At the same time, Denisovans are not simply absorbed into a vague idea of ancient human blending. Their distinctiveness matters too. Genetic analyses show that they are not merely Eastern Neanderthals by another name. Their lineage separated enough to accumulate its own history. They carried genetic variants not found in the same form in Neanderthals or modern humans. They seem to have persisted across long spans and perhaps across ecologies broad enough to drive substantial adaptation. In some parts of the record, they appear as a ghost population behind later genomes, visible more through inherited fragments than through bones. That alone makes them unusual. They are at once one of the best genetically attested ancient human lineages and one of the least anatomically known. This tension between clarity in genetics and uncertainty in anatomy has reshaped the field. For much of the 20th century, human evolution was told largely through bones and tools. Now genetics forces a second narrative alongside the first, and sometimes the two do not align as neatly as expected. A jawbone or skull may be difficult to assign with confidence, while a genome can reveal a precise set of relationships invisible to the eye. Denisovans sit at the centre of that shift. They demonstrate that the human family tree cannot be built from anatomy alone, especially in regions where the fossil record is sparse or poorly preserved. But they also remind us that genes without bodies tell only part of the story. We may know their relatives more clearly than we know their faces. There is another layer to their place in the family tree that makes the story even stranger. Some genetic evidence hints that Denisovans themselves may carry ancestry from an even older human lineage, perhaps one that split from the rest of the human family much earlier. This remains an area of active research and interpretation, and scientists are careful not to overstate what the current data can prove. But if the signal is real, then Denisovans are not merely a sister lineage to Neanderthals. They are also a vessel carrying echoes of even deeper human history. In other words, the Denisovan genome may preserve traces not only of its own branch, but of older branches already mostly lost. A lineage once thought of as obscure becomes, in this light, a kind of archive. The consequence of all this is that Denisovans force a more mature picture of human origins. They show that ancestry is layered, that relatedness is not simple, and that disappearance is not always clean. They belong close to Neanderthals, but not beneath them. They are near us, but not a step on the way to us. They emerge from the same wider ancestral world that produced other humans, then follow their own path through Asia, meeting some lineages, separating from others, and eventually leaving descendants among people still living today. They're neither a side note nor a missing rung. They are part of the main human story, one of the branches that makes the tree look less orderly and more real. And perhaps that is why the family resemblance matters so much. The closer Denisovans appear to the rest of us, the harder it becomes to think of the ancient world as populated by a single, rightful humanity surrounded by failed experiments. That old idea has not survived contact with the evidence. Instead, the Pleistocene now looks like a long age of multiple human forms, some familiar, some barely seen, all of them inheritors of older splits and participants in later meetings. Denisovans belong fully within that crowded family. They are more than Neanderthal cousins because the very notion of cousin, though useful, is too domestic and too simple for the scale of what they represent. They are one of the great lost branches of our own extended humankind, close enough to meet us in the deepest biological sense, distant enough to remain partly unknowable, and important enough to remind us that the human family was once far larger than the survivors alone would suggest. For a people who may once have ranged across enormous parts of Asia, Denisovans remain almost absurdly hard to picture. This is one of the central frustrations of their story, and also one of the reasons it holds such power. Most vanished human groups enter the imagination through the body. A skull appears. A jaw emerges from the ground. A reconstruction follows brow ridges, nose shape, the slope of the forehead, the heaviness of the jaw, the posture of the neck. Even if much remains uncertain, the public is given a face to remember. Denisovans resist that process. They are known with growing confidence as a lineage, yet they remain physically elusive, like a people seen through their shadow rather than directly in light. The problem begins with scarcity. The fossil evidence securely linked to Denisovans is painfully limited. A finger bone from Denisova cave, several large teeth, fragments of bone. Later, a jawbone from Baishia Karst cave on the northeastern Tibetan plateau, identified through protein analysis rather than ancient DNA. A few additional clues from sedimentary DNA and scattered remains that strengthen the case for their wider presence. Compared with the fossil record of Neanderthals, this is almost nothing. There is no complete Denisovan skeleton. No intact Denisovan skull has yet emerged to settle the matter. No full body lies waiting to resolve the guesswork. Science has, in effect, discovered a major branch of humanity before it has really seen what that branch looked like. This reverses the ordinary emotional logic of paleoanthropology. Usually, physical remains generate the first sense of recognition, and genetics later refines the picture. With Denisovans, genetics leads and anatomy trails behind. The result is an unusual imbalance. We know they existed. We know roughly where they belong in the human family. We know they interbred with Neanderthals and with modern humans. We know some of their inherited traits survive in living populations. But when it comes to their faces, bodies, and outward appearance, much of the picture remains tentative. Scholars still debate how much can be responsibly inferred from the limited remains, and the evidence remains incomplete enough that caution matters. The temptation to fill in the blanks too confidently is strong. It should be resisted. Even so, the fragments do say something. The Denisovan molars from Denisova cave are striking for their size and robust character. They appear larger and more massive than those of recent modern humans, and in some ways they look surprisingly archaic. Teeth matter more than they might seem to a modern observer. They are among the most durable parts of the skeleton, and often preserve when more fragile bones do not. In paleoanthropology, they are rich with information about development, ancestry, diet, and variation. The Denisovan teeth suggest a population that retained some features not typical of later modern humans, and perhaps not entirely shared with Neanderthals either. Yet teeth alone cannot build a face. They can imply power in the jaw, perhaps, or certain developmental patterns, but not the full outward person. The jawbone from the Tibetan plateau has widened the physical picture somewhat. Found at Baishia Karst Cave, it is a robust lower jaw with large teeth, and its identification as Denisovan through protein evidence was a major step because it linked the lineage to a place far from the Altai and to one of the harshest inhabited regions on Earth. The jaw itself suggests a strong, substantial individual, but again, a mandible is not a face. It can tell us something about chewing forces, structural robustness, and perhaps broad affinities with other archaic humans, but it cannot on its own resolve the overall anatomy of the skull, the shape of the nose, the brow, the proportions of the limbs, or the visual impression a Denisovan would have made when standing in firelight. We remain, in a literal sense, jaw-deep in uncertainty. This absence has forced scientists to become inventive, though not all inventions are equally secure. Some researchers have tried to infer Denisovan appearance indirectly from genetic patterns associated with physical traits, but this is difficult and often uncertain. Genes do not translate neatly into faces, especially in ancient populations whose full biological context is poorly known. Others compare the sparse Denisovan fossils with Middle Pleistocene Asian remains that may or may not belong somewhere near the Denisovan branch. This too is risky. Similar traits can arise for different reasons, and fragmentary fossils invite overinterpretation. No single explanation fully accounts for the relationship between Denisovans and the wider pool of archaic Asian fossils. The boundary between informed inference and wishful reconstruction is thin. There have also been attempts to generate Denisovan facial reconstructions through methods that combine genomic information, anatomical comparison, and statistical prediction. These efforts are fascinating, and some are carried out with admirable restraint, but they remain provisional. They may offer a plausible impression rather than a recovered truth. A reconstructed Denisovan face can be useful as a thinking tool, a way to remind modern audiences that these were embodied people rather than abstract data points. But it can also become misleading if presented with too much confidence. The public naturally craves an image, and museums often feel pressure to provide one. Yet honesty requires admitting that Denisovans are still largely faceless in the conventional fossil sense. That does not mean they were physically indeterminate. On the contrary, they must have had recognizably human bodies, specific regional features, distinctive developmental patterns, and perhaps visible traits that would have mattered in face-to-face encounters with other groups. They may have varied substantially across their range, especially if the Denisovan lineage included multiple populations spread from Siberia to the Tibetan plateau and perhaps into warmer parts of Asia. A cold-adapted northern group might not have looked identical to a Denisovan-related population farther south. Body size, facial breadth, limb proportions, and other traits may have shifted with ecology and isolation. What survives in the record suggests diversity rather than uniformity. The tragedy is that the bones needed to reveal that diversity have mostly not survived, or not yet been identified. Still, bodily inference does not begin and end with skull shape. Denisovans had to live in the environments already glimpsed in the earlier story, and bodies are part of adaptation. The genetic evidence pointing toward high-altitude adaptation among Tibetans, tied to Denisovan ancestry, suggests that at least some Denisovan populations had already undergone physiological adjustments to low-oxygen environments. This does not tell us their facial appearance, but it does tell us something profound about their biology. These were not merely humans passing briefly through extreme landscapes. At least some appear to have been adapted enough to leave useful genetic variants behind. That implies generations of residence, selection, and bodily adjustment to places where breath comes thin and survival is costly. There is also the question of growth and development. The finger bone from Denisova cave belonged to a young female, and the genome recovered from it was so well preserved that researchers could place her within the Denisovan lineage with remarkable confidence. Yet because the bone is so small and anatomically limited, it tells us almost nothing about the appearance she might have grown into. This is part of the almost cruel asymmetry of the evidence. One of the most famous Denisovans in science is known intimately at the genetic level and almost not at all in physical form. We know she belonged to a vanished human population. We know, in broad terms, her relatives. We do not know the look of her eyes, the contours of her cheekbones, the rhythm of her gait, or the sound of her breathing in cold air. Deep prehistory permits this kind of nearness and distance at once. The lack of a clear Denisovan body has consequences beyond public imagination. It complicates the identification of other fossils across Asia. There may be Denisovan remains already found but not securely recognized, sitting among collections of archaic human fossils that do not fit comfortably into established categories. Some Chinese Middle Pleistocene fossil, for example, have sometimes been discussed in connection with Denisovans, though often cautiously and without consensus. If a well-preserved Denisovan cranium were discovered tomorrow, it might reorganize an entire shelf of older debates. Fossils that now seem puzzling might suddenly fall into clearer relation. Or the opposite might happen. The new skull might reveal that Denisovans looked unlike anyone currently expects. Until such a discovery arrives, classification remains partly suspended. This uncertainty is not simply an obstacle. It is also a clue about the nature of the human past. It tells us that visibility in the fossil record is uneven, and that entire lineages can remain physically obscure for reasons that have nothing to do with their former importance. Preservation is biased. Discovery is biased. Cold caves keep secrets differently from humid lowlands. Some bodies fossilize, most do not. Some sites are excavated for generations. Others are lost beneath development, erosion, or rising seas. Denisovans may feel ghostly not because they were marginal, but because the conditions that would have preserved and revealed them were rare. And perhaps that is why the effort to imagine them becomes so charged. When the evidence is abundant, imagination has less room to roam. When the evidence is scarce, every fragment seems to radiate possibility. A large tooth becomes a hint of the whole skull. A jawbone becomes a doorway to an entire plateau world. A genomic pattern becomes the outline of a vanished body. Yet the discipline of good history and good science lies in refusing to confuse the doorway with the room itself. Denisovans deserve better than convenient invention. Their mystery is real, and it is more powerful when left honestly unresolved. What can be said, carefully, is that they were likely robust humans in at least some regions, carrying a combination of traits shaped by deep ancestry and local adaptation. They were close enough to Neanderthals to share a more recent common lineage with them than with us, but distinct enough to be something more than an Eastern version of the same people. They lived long enough and widely enough to develop population diversity of their own. Some of their traits may have looked archaic by the standards of later Homo sapiens, though even that word can mislead. Archaic does not mean primitive in any simple sense. It means belonging to a different arrangement of the human form, one successful in its own landscapes for a very long time. So Denisovans remain among the strangest presences in the human story a known unknown, a lineage identified securely but seen only in broken outline. They're close enough to be family and distant enough to remain faceless. Science can sequence their inheritance, track their relationship to other humans, and detect the lingering fragments of their biology in living people, yet still hesitate when asked the simplest of ancient questions: what did they look like? For now, the answer is incomplete. A jaw, teeth, a few bones, a set of cautious guesses, and beyond them, a human form still waiting in the dark for the earth to give up more of its secret. Once Denisovans are no longer confined in the imagination to one cave and a handful of famous fragments, the scale of the mystery changes immediately. They cease to be a local curiosity of the Altai and begin to look like something much larger, a population, or perhaps a family of related populations, spread across great arcs of Asia over long stretches of time. This widening picture does not come from one dramatic discovery that settles everything at once. It emerges slowly from genetics, from protein evidence, from fossil hints, from the uneven distribution of inherited Denisovan ancestry in living people, and from the stubborn realization that a lineage leaving traces from Siberia to the edge of the Tibetan plateau was almost certainly not living its entire history in one Siberian cave. The cave remains important because it is where science first learns the name, but names can mislead when they cling too tightly to their place of origin. Denisovans are named after Denisova Cave for the practical reason that the first recognized remains come from there. That does not make the Altai their sole home any more than a Roman coin found in one field means Rome existed only in that field. The broader evidence strongly suggests movement, range, and regional variation. A lineage that interbred with populations ancestral to people now living far to the south and east had to have occupied, or at least touched, landscapes vastly larger than the cold forests and valleys of southern Siberia. The challenge is that the farther one follows them outward, the more the record thins and fragments. One of the most important clues comes from the Tibetan plateau, or more precisely from its northeastern margin, where Bashir Karst Cave has yielded a robust human jawbone later identified as Denisovan through ancient protein analysis. This find matters for several reasons at once. It links Denisovans to a region of extreme altitude. It proves that the lineage was not restricted to the Altai, and it suggests a degree of ecological range that is difficult to overstate. The Tibetan plateau is not merely high, it is a demanding world of cold, wind, low oxygen, and seasonal scarcity. A place where long-term human occupation requires bodily adaptation as well as practical skill. If Denisovans were living there well before modern humans became established in such environments, then they were not only widespread, they were capable of surviving at one of the hard edges of the inhabited world. This begins to change how their geography is imagined. Instead of picturing a small, isolated population, it becomes more plausible to imagine a lineage stretched across northern and central Asia in different clusters, perhaps moving through mountain corridors, river systems, upland margins, and regions that opened and closed with climatic change. The Altai and the Tibetan plateau then look less like separate curiosities and more like preserved points within a larger map, points where the Earth happened to keep enough evidence for us to notice. Between them lies a vast space where people may have lived for millennia, without leaving remains that survive in recognizable form. China, in particular, looms behind the Denisovan story like a half-lit archive. There are Middle and Late Pleistocene human fossils from different parts of China that do not fit comfortably into the most familiar categories. Some show combinations of traits that seem unusual or mosaic, neither clearly modern human nor easily folded into classic Neanderthal patterns. Over the years, some researchers have suggested that certain enigmatic Asian fossils might belong somewhere close to the Denisovan lineage, or to populations related to it. These suggestions remain debated, and often for good reason. Without direct ancient DNA or some other decisive link, caution is necessary. Similar anatomy does not automatically equal shared identity. Still, the very persistence of such debates hints at a broader truth. Asia likely hosted forms of human diversity that the older, more Eurocentric model of prehistory never properly accounted for. The problem is preservation. Warm climates are cruel to ancient DNA. Many open-air sites preserve little. Bones fragment, weather, dissolve, and disappear. Caves can help, but not every region has the same cave record, and not every cave is discovered or excavated in time. This means the Denisovan presence may be strongest precisely where conditions were kind enough to preserve a trace, not necessarily where they were most numerous. A cold cave in Siberia speaks loudly because it can. A forested valley in ancient Southeast Asia may have held generations of Denisovan-related people, and now say almost nothing because heat, water, and time have stripped the evidence away. Absence on the map does not mean absence in the past. That becomes especially important once modern human genetics enters the story. Populations in island Southeast Asia, New Guinea, and Australia preserve some of the strongest Denisovan-related ancestry found in living humans. This is one of the great clues that forces the map outward. If Denisovan ancestry survives at notable levels in Papuan populations and in Aboriginal Australians, then the encounters that produced that ancestry must have happened somewhere along the routes taken by the ancestors of these groups as they moved through Asia and onward into Sahul, the great Ice Age landmass that once joined Australia and New Guinea when sea levels were lower. The simplest conclusion is not that Denisovans lived in New Guinea or Australia themselves, though that cannot be ruled on present evidence, but that Denisovan-related populations occupied parts of mainland or island Asia through which modern humans passed. This is where the mystery becomes even more intricate, because the genetic patterns do not always point to a single neat source. Some analyses suggest that the Denisovan ancestry and populations of Oceania may derive from one deeply divergent Denisovan-related population, while traces in some East Asian populations may reflect contact with another. In other words, there may not have been one Denisovan population spread thinly across the continent, but several Denisovan-like groups with significant regional diversity. Scholars still debate the exact model, and the evidence remains incomplete, but no single explanation fully accounts for all the ancestry patterns in living people if Denisovans are treated as a single uniform group. The wider the geography grows, the more probable internal diversity becomes. This possibility makes sense in human terms. A lineage spread across thousands of miles, through mountains, plateaus, forests, and perhaps tropical island chains, would not remain biologically and culturally uniform forever. Populations separate. Landscapes impose local pressures. Routes open and close. Some groups become isolated. Others reconnect after long absences. Over time, distinctive local Denisovan populations could have emerged, sharing deep ancestry but differing in appearance, adaptation, and perhaps behavior. We do not yet know how far that diversity went, but it would be surprising if a lineage so wide-ranging had no regional variation at all. Another clue to their spread comes not from bones, but from sediments. One of the quiet revolutions in recent archaeology is the ability to recover ancient DNA directly from cave sediments, even when identifiable human bones are missing. This method has already begun to reveal Denisovan presence in places where no obvious Denisovan skeleton lies waiting. It changes the nature of absence. A cave floor, once thought silent unless it yielded bones or tools, may still preserve the biological trace of people who passed through it. In this sense, Denisovans are again ahead of the eye. Their presence is sometimes registered first as a molecular residue, a sign that the land remembers them chemically even when anatomy has vanished. Yet the more their range expands, the more caution matters. It is tempting to turn Denisovans into a catch-all label for every mysterious archaic human in Asia. That would be a mistake. Asia's Pleistocene record is complex, and not every strange fossil or genetic signal automatically belongs to Denisovans. Some remains may represent other populations altogether, perhaps older survivors, perhaps lineages still poorly defined, perhaps mixtures that resist easy classification. Denisovans are important precisely because they open the door to this complexity, not because they solved all of it. Good science has to keep both possibilities in view. Denisovans were more widespread than once imagined, and Asia may still have contained additional human diversity beyond even them. Still, even conservative reading leads to a striking conclusion. Denisovans were almost certainly one of the major human presences of ancient Asia. They were not an obscure side branch living briefly in one cold corner of Siberia. They were spread enough to leave descendants in widely separated later populations, established enough to persist in multiple environments, and successful enough to overlap with Neanderthals, with early modern humans, and perhaps with still other archaic groups. Their world may have included mountain refuges, plateau camps, river valleys, and migration corridors now drowned or erased. Their numbers, their languages, their social structures, and the full extent of their range remain unknown. But the scale implied by the evidence is too large to ignore. That scale changes the emotional weight of their disappearance. It means that when Denisovans fade from the record, what is lost is not simply a small, marginal people. What disappears is a broad field of human life spread across much of Asia. Some of that disappearance may have happened by absorption into other populations. Some may have been local extinction. Some populations may have vanished early, others later. In one region, the lineage might have narrowed into descendants within modern humans. In another, it may have ended entirely. Extinction, once again, becomes less like a single vanishing point and more like a map slowly losing colour. So the Denisovan story continues to widen. The finger bone in Siberia is still the spark, but the fire it lights reaches much farther than the cave where it began. Across the Tibetan plateau, through Eastern Asia, into the routes that led toward island Southeast Asia and Sahul. Traces of Denisovan ancestry and Denisovan-related presence suggest a human world far more extensive than the first discovery implied. They were not merely in one place. They were across places, adapting, enduring, meeting others, and leaving fragments of themselves in lands where their bones have mostly not survived. The farther the evidence spreads, the clearer one thing becomes. Denisovans were a people of Asia on a continental scale, and the little that remains of them is only the surviving edge of something once much larger. A human population does not spread across difficult landscapes by accident, and it does not remain there for millennia through luck alone. Denisovans, whatever their full range and internal diversity may have been, had to know how to live at the edge of what the human body can tolerate They had to find food in worlds that were seasonal, unstable, and often dangerous. They had to move through cold valleys, upland plateaus, and perhaps dense lower landscapes where visibility was short and preservation is now shorter. They had to raise children in places where a single bad decision could become fatal with brutal speed. Their fossils are few, but the environments attached to them are eloquent. They suggest not a marginal people barely surviving, but a lineage repeatedly capable of making hard worlds livable. That begins with food, because all prehistoric endurance is built on the daily problem of energy. In Ice Age Eurasia, calories are geography. Large herbivores move along particular routes. Plant foods surge and vanish with the season. Rivers produce fish, or crossing points, or animal concentrations depending on place and time. A population living in such worlds must do more than hunt bravely. It must understand timing. It must know when deer gather, when herds descend, when a harsh season makes scavenging possible, when stored fat matters more than fresh meat, when an exposed ridge offers visibility and when it offers only risk. Denisovans almost certainly depended heavily on animal resources in many environments, as other Pleistocene humans did, though the exact balance of plant and animal foods would have varied by region. What survives in the record suggests flexible subsistence rather than one single strategy. Stone tools from Denisova Cave and other broadly relevant sites hint at this flexibility, though material culture remains one of the more difficult parts of the story. Archaeological layers in caves often contain artifacts made by different human groups at different times, and assigning a specific toolkit confidently to Denisovans is not always simple. That uncertainty matters. It prevents easy claims that a particular blade or scraper belongs to one lineage alone. Still, Denisovans clearly lived in a world where stone technology was central to survival, and they must have used cutting, scraping, shaping, and butchering tools suited to local needs. The exact traditions may have differed from one region to another. A population spread across broad parts of Asia would not necessarily make tools in identical ways everywhere. Scholars still debate the cultural signatures most securely tied to Denisovans, and the evidence remains incomplete. But no single explanation is needed to see the larger point: they were practical and adaptable tool users, surviving in demanding conditions. Adaptation at the edge also means shelter, and here caves are both literal and misleading. Denisova Cave has made the lineage famous, but caves are not the whole of Denisovan life. They are simply the places where traces preserve unusually well. A cave can offer protection from wind, predators, and some of the seasonal violence of climate. It can hold firelight, stored materials, sleep and space, memory of repeated use. But most human life, even in prehistory, does not happen only inside caves. Denisovans likely used rock shelters, temporary camps, open-air sites, and terrain features now invisible to archaeology. The record privileges what stone and cold can keep. It does not preserve the full range of decisions made day after day on the landscape. To imagine Denisovans only as cave dwellers would be to confuse survival evidence with survival itself. Fire, too, sits near the center of any realistic picture. In cold and high settings, fire is not simply comfort, it is physiological insurance. It protects against hypothermia, extends usable hours into darkness, changes the value of food, hardens or alters materials, and creates a social center around which memory and instruction can accumulate. Evidence of repeated fire use in Pleistocene cave occupations more broadly makes it all but certain that Denisovan populations living in northern or upland environments depended on it. Yet fire is one of those ancient technologies that vanishes into normality when it is done well. It leaves ash, discoloration, hearth traces if the site is preserved, but it also disappears from the dramatic imagination because it seems obvious. In truth, keeping fire alive across seasons, weather shifts, and movements is a kind of expertise, and one that would have mattered enormously in the worlds Denisovans inhabited. Then there is altitude, one of the clearest examples of Denisovan adaptation leaving a legacy in living humans. The EPAS, one gene variant found in many Tibetans, associated with improved adaptation to low oxygen environments, appears to have been inherited through ancient admixture from Denisovan-related ancestry. The significance of this is difficult to overstate. It means that at least one Denisovan population was not merely passing through high elevations, but was biologically shaped enough by them to evolve traits later useful to Homo sapiens. High-altitude adaptation is not superficial. Thin air stresses the heart, lungs, blood chemistry, fetal development, and long-term survival. A lineage contributing useful variants in this context must have endured repeated selection under those conditions. Here the Denisovan story becomes unusually concrete. We are not dealing only with a lost people once present in the mountains. We are dealing with a vanished population whose bodily response to mountain life still assists humans living there now. That inheritance encourages a broader insight. Adaptation is not always visible in bone. A skull may look one way or another, but survival can depend on invisible physiology, on subtle changes in oxygen transport, immune response, metabolism, cold tolerance, developmental timing, or other traits not easily read from fossil fragments. This is one reason Denisovans can remain anatomically obscure yet biologically important. Their legacy survives partly in functions rather than forms. The body remembers through performance as much as through appearance. In some cases, the most decisive Denisovan contribution may not have been how they looked, but how their genes helped later humans endure difficult ecologies. Still, physical adaptation alone cannot explain life at the edge. Social adaptation matters just as much. Harsh environments punish isolation. A single hunter injured far from help, a small family cut off by weather, a child sick in a season of scarcity. Any of these can threaten continuity. Populations surviving long-term in difficult landscapes likely relied on knowledge networks, shared food, cooperative care, and remembered roots. We cannot recover Denisovan language or social organization directly, but it would be strange if such a widespread lineage survived without durable systems of teaching and mutual dependence. Tool-making, fire maintenance, seasonal movement, predator avoidance, and child-rearing in severe environments are all learned. They require transmission. They imply communities with memory. The edge also sharpens attention to prey. In cold open environments, large herbivores may offer enormous returns but also high risk. In mountain landscapes, animals like ibex, wild sheep, deer, or yak-like species in some regions may demand different tactics than reindeer or horse on open steppe. Hunting in such settings is less a single heroic act than a set of decisions about terrain, weather, energy expenditure, and cooperation. The archaeological record from Denisovan-associated contexts does not yet allow a full behavioural portrait, but cut-marked animal bones and the broader logic of Pleistocene life strongly suggest regular meat acquisition and processing. Whether Denisovans pursued large game aggressively, scavenged opportunistically, trapped smaller animals, or shifted seasonally among all these strategies likely depended on place and time. Flexibility is again the safest conclusion. There may also have been technological and cultural subtleties now mostly lost. Ornaments and carefully worked objects from Denisova Cave have drawn attention. because they suggest skill, planning, and perhaps forms of symbolic behavior, though the exact makers of every item remain debated. Even without assigning each artifact too neatly, the broader point stands: the human populations inhabiting this region were capable of more than bare subsistence. Fine craftsmanship, material selection, and perhaps aesthetic or social signalling existed somewhere in this world. Denisovans, living alongside or within such archaeological horizons, should not be imagined as heavy-bodied survivors concerned only with immediate hunger. Like other ancient humans, they likely inhabited social and material worlds richer than their fragmentary remains allow us to see. Life at the edge also means exposure to repeated uncertainty. Climate shifts would have altered migration routes, prey abundance, and the accessibility of familiar shelters. A valley dependable in one period might become hostile in another. This rewards populations able to improvise without abandoning inherited knowledge. It also may help explain why Denisovans appear across such varied environments. The same long evolutionary experience that made them successful in one hard setting may have made them unusually capable of exploiting others. Not every population would thrive equally everywhere, but as a lineage they seem marked by environmental breadth. No single explanation fully accounts for their range, yet adaptability is clearly part of it. The paradox is that this competence survives mostly as indirect proof. There is no Denisovan manual of mountain hunting, no preserved camp where every activity can be reconstructed, no body clothed for winter. Instead, there is the harder kind of evidence: enduring presence in hostile places, genetic contribution to later human adaptation, repeated signs that they were not ecological specialists trapped in one narrow niche. They look, from the distance of the record, like people who knew how to stay alive where staying alive was never simple. And perhaps that is the most important correction. It is easy to romanticize ancient humans as noble survivors, and just as easy to patronize them as crude and barely capable. Denisovans fit neither picture. They were a successful human lineage in the fullest Ice Age sense: knowledgeable, adaptable, embodied in their landscapes, and resilient enough to persist across generations under pressures that would overwhelm the unprepared. They lived where air thinned, winters hardened, prey moved unpredictably, and other humans might arrive at any time from the horizon. Their story is not only about disappearance, it is also about competence. Before they became a ghost in our DNA, they were people of the edge, and for a very long time, the edge was where they knew how to live. When Homo sapiens begins moving more decisively into the vast spaces of Asia, the land is not waiting empty. It is already occupied by histories older than our own. Denisovans are there in at least some of those histories, and so are Neanderthals in others, along with the lingering shadows of still more archaic populations that remain difficult to classify. This matters because the spread of modern humans is often told too cleanly, as if our species steps onto a vacant stage and gradually fills it with its own success. The reality is more crowded, more uncertain, and in some ways more intimate. Our species arrives not as the first humans to master these environments, but as the latest in a world already shaped by others. The timing of that arrival is complicated, and the details are still debated. Modern humans emerge in Africa long before they become the dominant human presence across Eurasia. There are dispersals outward at different moments, some perhaps limited or temporary, some more enduring. By around 60,000 to 50,000 years ago, Homo sapiens is moving widely enough across Asia, and beyond that contact with Denisovan populations becomes not merely possible, but likely inevitable. In some regions that contact may have come earlier, in others, later. The evidence remains incomplete, and no single migration model captures every local variation. But the broader pattern is secure enough the late Denisovan world overlaps with the expanding world of modern humans. To understand what that overlap means, it helps to imagine movement not as one great march, but as a chain of local advances, retreats, pauses, and reorientations. Small populations do not cross continents like arrows on a map. They move through real landscapes, constrained by water, prey, climate, social ties, and the knowledge they carry. Some groups press onward along coasts or river valleys, others settle for generations in one region, others vanish. In that mosaic of movement, Homo sapiens enters territories that Denisovan populations may have known for immense spans of time. This does not automatically imply constant confrontation. Sometimes overlap may have meant distant coexistence, neighbouring occupations, or seasonal use of the same broader region without direct encounter. At other times, the contact would have been immediate and irreversible. What made our species different in these moments has been debated for decades, sometimes too simplistically. Older narratives loved sharp contrasts. Modern humans were said to possess superior cognition, superior tools, superior language, superior symbolic behaviour, and therefore to have swept aside other humans with near inevitability. The evidence no longer supports such a neat triumphal story. Denisovans and Neanderthals alike belong to human lineages capable of long survival in demanding environments. They were not passive relics waiting to be replaced. At the same time, Homo sapiens does appear to have brought certain advantages in mobility, networking, demographic resilience, and perhaps cultural flexibility in some contexts. The challenge is that these advantages may not have operated the same way everywhere. Scholars still debate the balance between technology, population size, social structure, climate instability, and pure contingency in explaining why our species expanded while others disappeared. The overlap with Denisovans likely played out across more than one setting. In the north, perhaps along upland corridors or valleys linking colder regions of Asia. Modern humans entering new ecological zones may have encountered populations deeply adapted to those places already. In the east and southeast, as Homo sapiens move through landscapes eventually leading toward island Southeast Asia and Sahel. Encounters with Denisovan-related groups may have occurred under very different ecological conditions. A lineage spread across large parts of Asia would not have met modern humans in one single moment of history. There would have been many thresholds, many local frontiers, many separate meetings whose full details are now erased. Some may have been tense. Some may have been fleeting. Some led unmistakably to children. That last fact changes the tone of the overlap immediately. Whatever else happened between Denisovans and Homo sapiens, it was not only avoidance or annihilation. The genetic evidence is clear that interbreeding occurred. That means the world of contact included not just territorial pressure or ecological competition, but recognition at a human scale. Individuals met, some formed reproductive unions. In practical terms, that implies at least moments of tolerance, proximity, negotiation, or incorporation. The ancient world was not a board game of abstract species pushing one another across a map. It was made of families, camps, strangers, risks, alliances, and choices. Extinction can begin in that intimate register just as easily as survival can. Still, overlap does not have to mean equality of momentum. Modern humans may have carried demographic advantages that became decisive over time. A lineage can be biologically close and culturally intelligent and still lose ground if its populations are smaller, more fragmented or less able to recover from environmental shocks. Homo sapiens appears, in many regions, to have built wider exchange networks, moved across diverse habitats with notable flexibility, and perhaps sustained larger or more connected populations than some of the archaic groups they encountered. None of this makes Denisovans inferior in any absolute sense. It means that in a changing world, resilience may depend not just on surviving the landscape, but on surviving the arrival of another highly adaptable human lineage. Climate amplifies this pressure. The late Pleistocene is not stable, and periods of abrupt change could have tightened resources, altered migration corridors, and forced populations into closer proximity. In such conditions, the arrival of modern humans may have acted not as a single cause but as an additional stress layered onto environments already becoming harder to predict. A Denisovan population that had survived for millennia in one region could suddenly face not only ecological disruption, but competition from groups with different movement patterns, technologies, or social reach. No single explanation fully accounts for how overlap translated into disappearance in each region, but it is easy to see how even small demographic imbalances, repeated over generations, can accumulate into large historical consequences. There is also the matter of learning. Contact between human groups does not only transmit genes, it may transmit knowledge, habits, pathogens, and ways of using the land. Some scholars have suggested that encounters between archaic humans and modern humans could have involved exchanges of techniques or local survival knowledge, though this is notoriously difficult to prove in the archaeological record. If so, then Denisovans may not have been merely the recipients of modern human pressure. In some places, they may also have been sources of adaptation, directly or indirectly. The Denisovan-derived genetic contribution to high-altitude adaptation in Tibet is one biological example of this wider possibility. It suggests a world in which the incoming species does not simply replace the older one, but also absorbs part of its hard-won experience. Yet the asymmetry remains. Modern humans continue. Denisovans do not, at least not as a distinct people. Somewhere in the long overlap, separate Denisovan identity thins and disappears. This may not have happened all at once. In one valley or region, a Denisovan group might have vanished entirely. In another, it may have been absorbed into growing modern human populations until its lineage survived only in fragments. In still another, contact may have been so limited that there was little direct interaction before local extinction. The record does not allow one grand scene of final encounter. Instead, it suggests a fading across landscapes, with modern humans gradually occupying more of the ecological and demographic ground. What makes this especially haunting is that the Denisovan disappearance begins while they are still present inside the future. A child born of Denisovan and modern human ancestry is not the end of a lineage in a simple sense. It is both continuation and dilution at once. The parent population remains itself for the moment, but some part of its future is already moving elsewhere, into a lineage that will survive long after the original people no longer do. This is one of the reasons the Denisovan story resists clean endings. Their contact with Homo sapiens does not produce only replacement, it produces inheritance. The extinguishing of one human population becomes entangled with the deepening complexity of another. There is no surviving Denisovan witness to that overlap, no memory handed down in words from the losing side. All that remains are indirect traces, genetic signatures, scattered fossils, sites that preserve evidence of repeated occupation, and the broad chronology of modern human expansion. From this, a picture emerges of a long human frontier moving through Asia, not empty but already inhabited, not silent but full of knowledge the new arrivals do not yet possess. Homo sapiens enters that world and does what our species so often does: adapts, spreads, borrows, survives, competes, and transforms the human landscape around it. Denisovans are part of what is transformed. By the time the story moves toward its next phase, the essential fact is already in place. Our species did not encounter Denisovans at the edge of myth, but in the ordinary severity of real land and real time. We met them in valleys, plateaus, caves, forests, or routes now lost beneath changing seas. We did not simply replace them from a distance. We overlapped with them. We altered one another. And in the biological sense that matters most, some of them crossed the threshold into us. The arrival of Homo sapiens in Denisovan territory was not the beginning of a clean succession. It was the opening of one of prehistory's strangest and most consequential periods of human coexistence. At some point in the long movement of peoples across Ice Age Asia, strangers stop being distant shapes on a ridge and become immediate, undeniable presences. A track near water, smoke where there should be none, a worked bone or a discarded flake in a place another group thought it knew. Then, eventually, the more dangerous moment bodies seen clearly. The Denisovan story is often told through genomes and population models, but those abstractions rest on encounters that were once real at the scale of breath and posture. Someone heard another human voice and recognized that it was not quite the voice of their own people. Someone watched unfamiliar faces in firelight. Someone made the decision to approach, to avoid, to exchange, to threaten, or to remain still. Somewhere in those moments, the future of whole lineages began to change. The evidence that Denisovans and modern humans interbred is now one of the best established parts of the story. It is not speculation layered onto a romantic image of prehistoric contact. It is visible in the genomes of living people and in the patterns of ancestry reconstructed from ancient DNA. This means the meetings between Homo sapiens and Denisovan populations did not end only in competition or separation. They also produced children, and those children became ancestors. The most important part of that fact is not merely biological. It tells us that contact was close enough, sustained enough, and socially possible enough for separate human populations to cross the boundary from coexistence into kinship. Whatever else they thought of one another, they were not wholly alien. That does not mean the meetings were easy. Interbreeding in prehistory is not proof of peaceful harmony. Human groups can exchange genes under many kinds of social conditions, some cooperative, some coercive, some ambiguous in ways the archaeological record will never recover. Scholars remain cautious for exactly this reason. DNA can show that children were born. It cannot reliably tell us the emotional or social circumstances under which those unions occurred. Still, the existence of Denisovan ancestry in later populations means such encounters happened often enough, or effectively enough, to leave a measurable legacy. This was not one impossible accident. It was part of the lived reality of overlapping human worlds. The pattern of Denisovan ancestry in living people suggests that these meetings happened more than once, and perhaps in more than one region. Populations in Oceania, especially Papuans, retain notably higher levels of Denisovan-related ancestry than most mainland populations, pointing towards significant episodes of admixture somewhere along the routes by which the ancestors of these groups moved through Asia. Some East Asian populations also carry smaller Denisovan-related traces, and the differences between these ancestry patterns suggest a more complex story than a single encounter followed by dispersal. The evidence remains incomplete, but what survives in the record suggests multiple episodes of contact with different Denisovan-related populations. perhaps at different times and in different ecological zones. In other words, there was not one meeting between our species and theirs. There were several spread across geography and generations. That multiplicity matters because it restores time to the story. It is tempting to imagine a single dramatic frontier where modern humans encounter Denisovans once, and history turns. But the real process may have been slower, more local, and more repetitive. One modern human group moving along a southern route may have met Denisovan-related people in one part of Asia and produced descendants carrying substantial ancestry. Another group, later or farther north, may have encountered a different Denisovan population and inherited other fragments. In one region, the admixture may have been brief. In another, it may have recurred over generations. No single explanation fully accounts for the patchwork pattern seen today, and that patchwork is precisely what gives the story its depth. The ancient individuals behind these patterns remain mostly anonymous. Yet one of the most extraordinary discoveries from Denisova Cave brings the whole matter painfully close. The young girl whose bone revealed that she had a Neanderthal mother and a Denisovan father is not direct evidence of Denisovan modern human mixing, but she proves something essential. Different human lineages in this world did not remain segregated by default. They could meet, mate, and produce viable offspring. Once that threshold is crossed for Neanderthals and Denisovans, it becomes easier to see Denisovan modern human admixture not as an implausible exception, but as part of a broader late Pleistocene reality. Ancient humanity was porous. The boundaries existed, but they leaked. What, then, might those meetings have been like? Here the record goes quiet, and responsible narration has to move carefully. We do not know the rituals, languages, gestures, or social codes that governed first contact between Denisovans and Homo sapiens. We do not know whether recognition of similarity came before fear, whether curiosity overcame hostility in particular places, or whether some meetings were violent while others passed almost gently into exchange. Yet the biological outcome tells us enough to imagine a world less rigid than the old textbook diagram suggested. People noticed difference, certainly, but difference was not enough to prevent contact from becoming personal. Ancient humans did not only replace or avoid one another, they also folded one another into the future. There is something quietly unsettling in that idea because it collapses the distance between extinct and living humans. It is one thing to know, abstractly, that Denisovans are relatives. It is another to understand that somewhere, in a camp or shelter or seasonal meeting place, a Denisovan woman held a child whose descendants would survive in Homo sapiens populations long after her own people disappeared, or a Denisovan man fathered children whose line would continue within modern humans while his separate lineage faded. The loss and the survival happened together. The very process by which Denisovans vanish as a distinct people may also be the process by which parts of them become unerasable. This is why the language of extinction becomes difficult. If a population disappears by complete death and replacement, the category feels clean, however tragic. If it disappears partly through absorption into another population, the result is harder to name. Denisovans did go extinct as a distinct lineage in the practical sense. There are no Denisovan communities alive today maintaining independent continuity. But if their ancestry survives in the descendants of admixture, then extinction is only one part of the truth. Another part is incorporation. Another is survival by dispersal. Their biological identity was not preserved intact, yet neither was it obliterated. It was redistributed. That redistribution may have had uneven consequences. In some descendants, Denisovan ancestry remained at low levels, diluted over time by further mixing. In others, especially where population histories amplified certain inherited segments, Denisovan-related DNA persisted more noticeably. Much of it may have been neutral or nearly so, simply carried forward by chance. Some segments may have been harmful and gradually removed by natural selection. Others proved useful enough to remain, especially where they aided survival in difficult environments. The meetings between Denisovans and modern humans therefore did not only create ancestry, they created a long experiment in inheritance, one in which the descendants of those ancient unions carried forward fragments that would later be kept, discarded, or favoured depending on circumstance. It is also possible that the cultural consequences of contact were more significant than the record can now show. Humans do not meet biologically alone. They observe tools, movement, shelter choices, prey knowledge, and social habits. Even brief encounters can teach. A modern human population entering a difficult upland or northern environment might have gained, directly or indirectly, from Denisovan familiarity with the land. A Denisovan group encountering Homo sapiens might have observed new ways of organizing movement, exchange, or material culture. The evidence for specific transfers is frustratingly thin, and scholars are right to remain cautious. But it would be odd if repeated close contact among human groups never involved any exchange beyond genes. The deeper emotional force of Denisovan modern human contact lies in what it reveals about the structure of the ancient world. Prehistory is often narrated through disappearance, because disappearance leaves dramatic edges. But the actual human past may have been held together as much by crossing as by isolation. Populations separated, yes, sometimes for immense spans. Yet when routes reopened or territories overlapped, those separations did not always hold. The Denisovan legacy inside living people exists because ancient boundaries were real but not absolute. Humanity, before it became singular in the modern sense, was plural and entangled. And perhaps that is what makes these encounters feel so immediate. They are not merely episodes in evolutionary theory. They are moments in which another human population, now gone, passed part of its inheritance into the bodies of future strangers. The Denisovans did not leave monuments to the meetings. They left descendants. Not descendants who stayed Denisovan, but descendants who became something else while carrying pieces of them forward. That is both more intimate and more unsettling than a ruin. A ruin sits outside the body. This legacy does not. So the story of meetings, mating, and shared children is not a side note in the Denisovan mystery. It is the hinge on which the whole paradox turns. Without those encounters, Denisovans would be a vanished lineage known from a cave, a few bones, and a handful of fossils. With them, they become part of the living human story in the strictest possible sense. Their separate world is gone, but some of its people stepped across the boundary of extinction before it closed. Their children, and their children's children, carried that crossing onward until it became invisible to memory and visible only to science. What looks from a distance like disappearance now reveals itself as something stranger, a people fading from the world while still entering it. By the time science begins tracing Denisovan ancestry in living people, the old meaning of disappearance has already started to come apart. A population once thought wholly lost turns out to survive unevenly, quietly, and in ways no one could have guessed from fossils alone. The inheritance is not spread equally across the human world. It does not appear as a universal background shared by all people to the same degree. Instead, it is patchy, regional, and historically revealing. In some populations, Denisovan ancestry is slight or nearly absent. In others, it is unmistakable. The pattern itself becomes a map, not of where Denisovans are now, but of where ancient meetings must once have happened. The most striking levels of Denisovan-related ancestry appear in populations connected to Oceania, especially Papuan groups, and also in Aboriginal Australians, though population histories are always complex, and no modern group should be treated as a frozen relic of the past. These communities are fully modern human populations with deep, dynamic histories of their own. What matters here is that their genomes preserve a larger Denisovan contribution than is typically seen elsewhere. This immediately tells us something profound about ancient movement. The ancestors of these populations, as they move through Asia and eventually into Sahul, must have encountered Denisovan-related groups somewhere along the way, and those encounters were substantial enough to leave a lasting signature. That signature is especially powerful because it survives despite tens of thousands of years of subsequent history. Migration, isolation, drift, adaptation, and local demographic change have all acted on these populations since the original admixture events. Yet Denisovan-related ancestry remains visible. It is like finding a faint colour that has somehow endured through countless repaintings of the same wall. The original moment is gone, but the trace remains strong enough to say that it happened and that it mattered. In a story with so few bones and so little direct material culture, this living inheritance becomes one of the most important archives Denisovans ever left behind. East Asia tells a subtler version of the same story. Some East Asian populations also carry Denisovan-related ancestry, though generally at lower levels than Papuans. At first glance, this might seem easy to explain as a diluted version of the same ancient admixture, but the genomic patterns are not always that simple. Some researchers have argued that the Denisovan ancestry found in East Asian populations may reflect a different episode of contact, perhaps involving a distinct Denisovan-related population from the one that contributed ancestry to Papuans. Scholars still debate the exact models, and the evidence remains incomplete, but the broad implication is significant. Denisovan inheritance in living humans may not come from one encounter with one group. It may record multiple encounters with multiple Denisovan populations spread across Asia. This possibility transforms the meaning of the DNA still inside us. It is not merely a residue of extinction, it is evidence of geography. It reveals that Denisovans, or Denisovan-like populations, were present in enough places and for enough time to intersect different branches of expanding Homo sapiens. The living human genome becomes, in this sense, a map of lost contact zones, not a perfect map, because later demographic events blur the lines, but a map nonetheless. It tells us that the ancient world was not divided into neat territories occupied by single human kinds. It was a shifting field of overlap in which multiple populations met under different conditions and left different legacies. The inheritance is also selective. Not every Denisovan fragment survived equally well. When admixture first occurred, ancient human descendants would have carried a larger share of Denisovan DNA than later populations do. Over time, recombination broke those segments into smaller pieces, mixing them into broader modern human genomes. Natural selection may have removed some fragments that proved harmful in modern human genetic backgrounds. Others drifted away by chance. The Denisovan ancestry visible today is therefore not the full inheritance that once existed. It is what remained after tens of thousands of years of sorting. This means the surviving fragments are both precious and incomplete. They represent Denisovan legacy, but not the whole of what was once passed on. That fact introduces a subtle sadness into the science. Even the Denisovans who survive inside us do so in broken form. No living human carries a Denisovan identity in full. What remains are segments, scattered fragments of ancient inheritance preserved through descent, recombination, and survival. It is a little like finding pages torn from a lost book and realizing that those pages have been copied into other books so thoroughly that the original volume no longer exists. The words remain, but not together, and not under the old title. Denisovans endure within us, but only as dispersed ancestry. Still, dispersed ancestry can speak with surprising force. It can reveal routes of migration that archaeology alone struggles to pin down. It can show that some encounters happened after particular modern human populations had already begun diverging from one another, because different descendant groups preserve different Denisovan signals. It can suggest that the settlement of Asia and the movement into Sahul were not simple one-way flows through empty landscapes, but journeys through regions where older human populations still lived. In this way, Denisovan DNA does more than confirm contact. It helps reconstruct the larger drama of Homo sapiens expansion, showing that our species spread not in isolation, but in negotiation with the human diversity already present. There is also a caution here worth keeping in view. Denisovan ancestry in living populations does not mean those populations are closer to being Denisovan in any simplistic sense. Modern human groups are not living windows frozen in time. They're shaped by their own histories, their own later admixtures, their own local adaptations, and their own deep continuities as Homo sapiens. The Denisovan contribution is one strand among many. It is historically significant without being the sole explanation for identity, culture, or biology. Scientists have been careful about this, and rightly so, because genomic discoveries can easily be misused when people mistake ancestry percentages for cultural essence. Denisovan inheritance is a clue to the past, not a verdict on the present. Even so, the present can illuminate the past in remarkable ways. By examining where Denisovan-derived sequences survive, scientists gain insight into the ancient structure of populations that have otherwise vanished almost completely. The genome becomes a kind of echo chamber, preserving not voices but impacts. A Denisovan population leaves no surviving settlement that can be visited, no written record, no preserved oral tradition, and almost no recognizable skeletal series. Yet through admixture it leaves a detectable mark in people living today. That is an extraordinary reversal of historical expectation. Usually the living inherit culture and stories while bodies perish. Here, culture is gone but biology remembers. This memory is not passive. In some cases, as later sections will explore more directly, Denisovan-derived variants appear to have mattered for survival, especially in difficult environments. That means the Denisovans did not simply leave traces that endured accidentally. Some of what they passed on may have been retained because it worked. In evolutionary terms, the ancient meetings between lineages did not just blend populations, they transferred solutions. A vanished people, shaped by Ice Age Asia in ways we're only beginning to understand, passed part of their hard-won adaptation into the future. Their DNA survives not only because it was inherited, but because under some conditions it remained useful. The broader emotional consequence is hard to avoid. Modern humans are used to imagining themselves as the end of the story, the last surviving branch after all others fell away. Denisovan ancestry undermines that neat isolation. It says that the line leading to us is not clean. It is touched by vanished kin. It contains contributions from populations we no longer see, whose bodies have mostly dissolved into the earth. Every time science identifies one of those Denisovan fragments in a living genome, the old boundary between then and now weakens again. The extinct stop feeling entirely gone. And yet they are gone, which is what makes the paradox so moving. The people themselves did not survive as separate communities. Their worlds, languages, habits, and local memories vanished. Their children's descendants continued, but under other names, in other societies, within a lineage that eventually became the only human one left standing. The Denisovan DNA still inside us is therefore not a resurrection. It is a remainder. It is what the long process of overlap reproduction and disappearance allowed to pass through the narrowing gate of time. Perhaps that is why this inheritance feels more haunting than a fossil. A fossil is a body from the past, fixed and finished. Denisovan ancestry is motion carried forward. It is evidence that extinction, in the human case, can happen with traces still alive in the survivors. A people can vanish and still participate in the future biologically. They can lose their separate existence while helping shape the bodies of those who replace and absorb them. When the genome reveals that truth, Denisovans stop being merely a lost population of the Ice Age. They become part of the structure of the present, hidden in living cells, silent but enduring, a reminder that ancient humanity was not erased cleanly. It was inherited unevenly, and some of that inheritance is still with us now. Some inheritances survive merely because they are carried along. Others survive because, in the cold arithmetic of natural selection, they prove useful. This is where the Denisovan story becomes even stranger, because the DNA they left inside modern humans does not always behave like a passive fossil lodged in the genome. In certain cases, it appears to have offered real advantages, helping later populations endure difficult environments long after Denisovans themselves had disappeared. A vanished people, shaped by worlds of altitude, climate, pathogens, and scarcity, may have handed down not only ancestry but tools for survival. Their legacy is not just that they mixed with us, it is that some of what they gave us mattered. The clearest and most famous example comes from the Tibetan Plateau. Life at high altitude places the human body under continuous stress. The air carries less oxygen. Breathing becomes harder. Pregnancy becomes riskier. Blood chemistry shifts. Organs work under strain. People raised near sea level often struggle badly when they ascend too fast, and even long-term residents can exact a price. Yet Tibetan populations show physiological adaptations that allow many people to live at high elevation with remarkable efficiency. One of the key genetic regions involved in this adaptation is associated with the EPAS1 gene, and the version common among Tibetans appears to have entered Homo sapiens through admixture with Denisovan-related ancestry. This is one of those rare moments when deep prehistory stops feeling abstract and becomes almost immediate. Somewhere in the ancient past, a Denisovan population or Denisovan-related group had already spent enough time in high-altitude environments for natural selection to shape useful physiological traits. Later, modern humans arriving in or near those same environments encountered them, interbred, and inherited part of that adaptation. Over generations, in the descendants living on the plateau, that inherited variant proved advantageous enough to persist and spread. The dead, in this case, did not merely leave traces. They left help. The Denisovan world, or at least one branch of it, had solved a problem of thin air, and part of that solution crossed into us. There is something deeply humbling in that. Modern humans are often cast as the great adaptive generalists, the species that can enter any landscape and make it home. There is truth in that. But the Denisovan contribution to Tibetan high-altitude adaptations suggests that, in at least some places, We did not solve everything alone. We inherited local expertise from another human lineage that had already been there longer. This does not diminish Homo sapiens. It makes the story more realistic. Human expansion across difficult environments may have depended, in part, on biological borrowing from populations already adapted to them. Conquest gives way to exchange, even if the exchange happened through intimate contact rather than conscious collaboration. High altitude is only the most dramatic example. Researchers have also investigated Denisovan-derived genetic variants that may affect immune function, metabolism, skin biology, or other physiological systems. Some of these proposed cases remain under debate, and scientists are careful about drawing strong conclusions too quickly. The genome is not a simple manual where every inherited fragment comes with a label explaining its purpose. Many variants have subtle effects. Some appear useful only in certain environments or in combination with other genes. Others may once have helped and now do little. The evidence remains incomplete, and no single explanation fully accounts for every Denisovan-derived segment preserved in living populations. Still, the broader pattern is suggestive. Denisovan ancestry did not survive at random alone. In some cases, it seems to have been favored. Immune-related inheritance is especially plausible in principle, because human populations moving into new regions often face unfamiliar pathogens. A lineage long established in a particular environment may carry genetic variants that help manage local disease pressures. If Homo sapiens encountered Denisovan populations in Asia and interbred with them, it is reasonable to suspect that some inherited immune variants might have been beneficial. Similar arguments have been made for Neanderthal-derived DNA in some modern human populations. But caution is necessary here. The immune system is extraordinarily complex, and identifying the precise historical effect of any one ancient variant is difficult. Some inherited archaic DNA may have been helpful in one setting and harmful in another. The important point is not that every Denisovan fragment had a clear purpose, but that admixture created a reservoir of possibilities upon which selection could act. This is where the Denisovan legacy begins to look less like a relic and more like an evolutionary transaction. Modern humans moving across Asia did not meet Denisovans only at the level of bodies and kinship. They encountered a lineage already shaped by local selection in places they themselves were still learning to survive. Through admixture, Homo sapiens gained access to part of that history. The Denisovans had already paid the price of adaptation in generations of exposure, mortality, and survival. Their descendants within our species inherited some of the results without having to evolve them from nothing. It is difficult to think of a more intimate transfer of environmental knowledge than that. At the same time, this inheritance must not be romanticized into a story where Denisovans become mystical guardians of lost wisdom encoded in our blood. They were not benevolent ancestors passing gifts forward by design. They were human populations living under pressure, adapting because failure meant death. The genes later useful to modern humans were, for Denisovans themselves, ordinary instruments of continued existence. What now looks to us like a remarkable evolutionary contribution was for them simply the hard-earned cost of staying alive in their own landscapes. Remembering that keeps the story grounded. Their legacy is powerful precisely because it emerged from ordinary survival, not legend. There is also the other side of inheritance. Not all Denisovan DNA that entered modern humans was necessarily beneficial. Some may have been neutral and simply drifted along until lost or retained by chance. Some may have been harmful in the new genomic or ecological context and been removed by natural selection over time. This is why the surviving Denisovan-derived segments visible in living people today are not a full archive of all admixture. They are a filtered archive. What remains is what endured the long test of recombination, population history, and selection. In that sense, the Denisovan legacy now visible is biased toward what could survive inside Homo sapiens. Much else may have vanished completely. That filtering gives the surviving fragments extra significance. They are not only ancient, they are survivors twice over. First, they survived the disappearance of Denisovans as a distinct people. Then they survived within modern humans through thousands of generations of further change. A Denisovan-derived variant that still persists today has passed through a narrowing corridor of time and circumstance. It has endured extinction, absorption, demographic upheaval, and evolutionary sorting. That makes each such fragment a kind of hardened remnant, not of culture or memory, but of biological continuity under extreme attrition. In a broader sense, these inherited traits also challenge the old assumption that extinct human lineages contribute only to the past, not to the present. Denisovans are gone, yes, but their influence is not confined to museums, academic journals, or the remote Ice Age. In plateau physiology, in perhaps some aspects of immune function, and possibly in other subtler biological patterns still being investigated, their history continues to shape living bodies. A vanished branch of humanity still participates, indirectly, in the present tense. That does not make Denisovans alive in any simple sense. It means the present human condition contains more ancient layering than it appears to on the surface. There is a philosophical discomfort in that realization. Modern identity likes clean borders. We like to know who is living, who is dead, who belongs to the past, and who belongs to the present. Denisovan inheritance blurs those categories. It does not undo extinction, but it complicates it. A people can disappear, and yet some of the adaptations forged in their long struggle with environment can outlast them inside another lineage. In that sense, the Denisovans did not merely vanish and leave descendants by accident. They left functional traces of their world, traces that continued to matter after their own communities were gone. And perhaps that is one of the deepest reasons this story lingers. It suggests that ancient humanity was not only diverse, but collaborative in ways no one intended. One population survives a landscape long enough to adapt to it. Another arrives later and inherits part of that adaptation through contact. Extinction and survival become tangled together. The dead do not simply make way for the living. They alter what the living can become. So when Denisovan genes appear in the bodies of modern humans living under harsh conditions, they should be understood not as curiosities but as evidence of an ancient transfer of resilience. Somewhere, long before written memory, Denisovan populations solved problems of altitude, disease, or ecological pressure in their own flesh. Later, through shared children and long descent, some of those solutions became ours as well. The Denisovans vanished as a people, but in a few crucial ways, they remain not only inside us, but still quietly helping us endure. For a long time, extinction seemed like the simplest part of the Denisovan story. They were here, then they were gone. Another vanished branch of humanity, one more name added to the growing register of lost worlds. But the closer the evidence is examined, the less clean that ending becomes. Denisovans do disappear as a distinct people. Their fossils stop. Their separate line dissolves. No surviving community carries their identity forward in recognizable continuity. And yet the causes of that disappearance remain frustratingly unresolved. Because deep prehistory rarely grants a single final answer. No dramatic chronicle records their decline. No last refuge stands clearly in view. Instead, there is a thinning in the record and a set of overlapping pressures, any one of which may have mattered, none of which alone fully explains everything. Climate is the first obvious suspect, and with good reason. Denisovans lived through a world of instability. Glacial and interglacial cycles reshaped habitats, shifted prey distributions, altered water availability, opened routes, and then closed them again. A population adapted to one ecological regime could find its familiar world rearranged within a few thousand years, which in evolutionary terms is both long and alarmingly short. Harsh climatic oscillations do not need to kill a lineage outright to weaken it. They can fragment populations, isolate groups in shrinking refugia, reduce food reliability, and make recovery from bad seasons less certain. If Denisovans were spread across varied landscapes, some populations may have weathered these changes well, while others may have narrowed into vulnerable pockets. Extinction, in such cases, is often cumulative rather than sudden. Still, climate alone is unsatisfying. Denisovans had already survived repeated environmental swings over immense spans of time, a lineage that endured across cold steppes, mountain corridors, and plateau edges was not fragile in any simple sense. It had already proven capable of flexibility. That does not mean later climate changes were irrelevant. It means they probably acted in combination with other pressures, rather than as a lone cause. Scholars still debate how severe particular regional changes were at the times Denisovan populations likely faded, and the evidence remains incomplete, especially in regions where preservation is poor. But the broader principle holds climate may have weakened the framework of Denisovan survival without delivering the final blow by itself. Then there is the arrival and spread of Homo sapiens, which cannot be ignored. Modern humans expanded through much of Asia during the later part of the Denisovan timeline, entering landscapes that Denisovans already inhabited or knew intimately. This overlap matters not because it guarantees direct extermination, but because it introduces a competitor equally human, highly adaptable, and demographically dynamic. Two lineages occupying similar ecological ground do not need to fight openly for one to displace the other. If Homo sapiens populations were larger, more connected, or more capable of rapid recolonization after local setbacks, they could gradually absorb territory and resources without a single decisive confrontation. Small advantages repeated over many generations can reshape a continent, yet replacement by competition is still only part of the picture, because interbreeding complicates everything. Denisovans did not merely confront modern humans, they also mixed with them. That means disappearance may have occurred partly through absorption. A Denisovan population encountering expanding Homo sapiens groups might, over time, lose its distinctiveness not because every member died, but because successive generations were increasingly incorporated into modern human communities. In biological terms, the lineage survives only in fragments. In social terms, it ceases to exist as a separate people. This is one of the reasons extinction is so difficult to define here. If a population vanishes by being gradually folded into another, is that extinction or transformation? The honest answer is that it is both. Absorption may have been especially important if Denisovan populations were already regionally fragmented. Imagine not one great people moving as a unified whole, but multiple Denisovan-related groups scattered across Asia, some small, some isolated, some more connected than others. In such a setting, contact with modern humans would not produce one uniform outcome. One local group might disappear entirely. Another might interbreed extensively and lose separate continuity. Another might persist longer in ecological refuges before finally fading. The record we possess, Patchian bias toward exceptional preservation is almost certainly collapsing many local histories into one generalized story. In reality, the Denisovan disappearance may have been a mosaic of endings. Disease is another possibility, though one harder to demonstrate directly. Whenever human populations long separated come into contact, pathogen exchange can matter. A lineage adapted to one disease environment may have little resistance to microbes carried by another group. The reverse can also be true. Modern history offers many devastating examples of such asymmetry. In deep prehistory, proving pathogen-driven population decline is extremely difficult, but it remains a plausible contributor. Denisovans encountering Homo sapiens might have faced not only demographic and ecological pressure, but disease burdens for which they were poorly prepared. This would not need to wipe them out instantly to matter. It would only need to reduce numbers, fertility, or resilience enough to tilt an already unstable balance. There is also the question of social scale. One of the more persistent ideas in discussions of human expansion is that Homo sapiens may have maintained broader exchange networks than other late archaic humans, allowing resources, mates, knowledge, and alliances to circulate over larger distances. If that is true, even in some regions and not all, it could have provided a subtle but powerful advantage. A population with wider social ties can recover from local scarcity more easily. It can draw mates from farther away, reducing inbreeding risk. It can share innovations or information about routes and resources more efficiently. By contrast, small isolated populations are especially vulnerable to bad luck. The Denisovans may have been highly competent in their environments, but competence alone cannot always offset demographic fragility. Genetic evidence from ancient and modern populations hints that some Denisovan groups may indeed have been relatively small or isolated at certain times, though the picture is still incomplete. Small populations can persist for long periods, especially in stable ecological niches, but they are always exposed to cumulative risk. A few failed seasons, a local environmental change, increased competition, disease, or loss of mobility corridors can become existential. Once numbers fall low enough, the problem can reinforce itself. Mate choice narrows, social networks thin, adaptability suffers. A lineage need not be dramatically defeated to disappear. It can simply become too scattered and too few. This possibility gives the Denisovan ending a quiet, almost uncomfortable realism. There may have been no final stand, no last refuge full of tragic grandeur, no singular catastrophe remembered in the land. There may only have been generations in which fewer camps were occupied, fewer children survived, more unions happened with outsiders, more local groups vanished, and the name we now give them slowly ceased to correspond to any living community. One valley falls silent, then another, somewhere else. Descendants continue under different ancestry patterns and different identities. Extinction in the human world may often look like this, not a curtain dropping, but a colour fading until only traces remain. Of course, there are more speculative explanations that sometimes attract attention. Popular imagination likes mystery sharpened into dramatic theory. Perhaps Denisovans were driven rapidly into marginal zones. Perhaps they were technologically outmatched in some decisive way. Perhaps their disappearance reflects unknown catastrophes or hidden conflicts. These possibilities are not always impossible in local cases, but the evidence does not support turning any one of them into a universal answer. Good science remains more restrained. The most likely explanation is not singular and cinematic, but layered climate instability, competition, demographic disadvantage, regional fragmentation, and interbreeding all contributing in different proportions across different parts of Asia. That layered explanation is less satisfying emotionally, but probably more true. Human disappearance is rarely tidy. Civilizations collapse for several reasons at once. Species decline through cascades rather than one blow. Populations are weakened by one pressure and finished by another. Denisovans fit that wider pattern. Their long success across difficult environments shows they were no evolutionary dead end waiting for history to begin. Their eventual fading suggests instead that even highly capable human lineages can disappear when ecological stress, demographic change, and the arrival of a rival lineage converge over time. And yet, because Denisovans also survive within us, their disappearance resists the finality we usually attach to extinction. This is perhaps the deepest paradox of all. The forces that helped erase them as a distinct people may be the same forces that carried their genes into the future. Contact with Homo sapiens likely contributed to Denisovan decline in some regions, but it also preserved part of Denisovan biology in modern human descendants. The mechanism of disappearance doubled as a mechanism of survival. That is not a contradiction. It is simply the human version of extinction, messier than the extinction of animals that leave no descendants in another lineage. So why did the Denisovans disappear? Because the world changed, because modern humans arrived, because populations fragment, because small numbers are vulnerable, because interbreeding dissolves distinction, because no lineage is guaranteed permanence, and because in deep time endings are often processes rather than events. No single explanation fully accounts for it, and perhaps none ever will. The record is too broken, the geographies too wide, the populations too varied, but the outline is clear enough to be moving. Denisovans were not struck from the earth in one instant. They were slowly outnumbered, absorbed, reduced, and erased as a separate people across a changing Asian world. What remains is not the certainty of a final cause, but the shape of a long fading, a lineage that once crossed mountains, endured thin air, survived cold valleys, and met other humans in the dark uncertainty of the Ice Age, gradually lost its separate hold on time. Its camps emptied, its bones stopped appearing, its world narrowed, and yet even as it disappeared, something of it went on living elsewhere, hidden within those who would outlast it. In that sense, the Denisovans did vanish, but they did not vanish cleanly. The more the Denisovan story comes into focus, the less the old image of human prehistory survives. For generations, the popular version of the past was stark and orderly. There were primitive humans, then more advanced humans, then finally us. One form replaced another, one species failed, another succeeded. The road to the present looked narrow, singular, almost inevitable. Denisovans helped destroy that illusion, not by themselves, but by making it impossible to ignore how crowded the ancient world really was. They belonged to a time when humanity was not one thing. It was many related things at once, overlapping in space, splitting in time, meeting again, exchanging genes, and disappearing unevenly across entire continents. That realization changes the emotional atmosphere of prehistory. The past becomes less like a parade and more like a landscape at dusk, full of movement partly seen and partly lost. Denisovans are one of the strongest proofs that the ancient world held multiple human lineages living side by side or near side by side, each carrying its own long adaptation, its own inherited knowledge, its own bodily history. Neanderthals did the same in Western Eurasia. Homo sapiens did the same in expanding waves across Africa and then outward. In parts of Southeast Asia, Homo floresiensis and perhaps other enigmatic populations add yet more complexity. The human story, once stripped of its comforting simplicity, begins to resemble an ecosystem rather than a lineage. This matters because ecosystems do not run on singular destiny. They run on coexistence, competition, adaptation, and chance, in a world of overlapping human groups. No single lineage has an obvious right to the future. Denisovans were not placeholders waiting to be replaced by us. They were participants in the same broad human drama, shaped by climate, geography, demography, and contact. Their eventual disappearance now looks less like the elimination of an inferior form and more like one outcome in a larger and more contingent history. That is not a minor change in perspective. It alters the meaning of being human. It suggests that our own survival was not simply the reward for inevitability, but one result among many that might once have gone differently. The evidence for overlap is no longer theoretical. Denisovans interbred with modern humans. They interbred with Neanderthals. A first-generation Neanderthal Denisovan individual from Denisova cave proves that these contacts were not vague background processes stretched thin across millennia. They happened at the scale of individual families. That fact alone should end any lingering desire to imagine ancient human groups as sealed biological islands. The boundaries were real, but they were permeable. Humanity in the late Pleistocene was not singular and isolated. It was braided. Once that is understood, the ancient world looks denser in every direction. A valley in Siberia is no longer just a place where one kind of human passed through. It may be a contact zone used by multiple populations across different periods, and sometimes within overlapping spans. A plateau cave in Tibet is no longer simply a high-altitude shelter. It is evidence that one branch of humanity had already mastered a severe environment before another branch inherited part of that mastery. A route through Southeast Asia is no longer a clean migration corridor for modern humans alone. It becomes a human crossroads where newcomers move through landscapes already inhabited by older lineages, some of whom left descendants inside the newcomers themselves. This layered picture also forces a new respect for regional complexity. Europe once dominated the story of human evolution in the modern imagination, because European fossils were earlier known, more frequently discussed, and easier to fit into familiar narratives centered on Neanderthals and modern humans. Denisovans shift the center of gravity eastward. They reveal that Asia was not merely a distant stage where Homo sapiens eventually arrived, but a major theatre of human diversity in its own right. There were lineages there not fully captured by the traditional categories. There were populations whose fossils are still hard to identify, whose genomes survive only in fragments, whose interactions shape the future even though their names were lost. The map of humanity grows broader and less Eurocentric the moment Denisovans are taken seriously. At the same time, overlap does not mean harmony. Ancient human plurality was not a utopia of mutual recognition. Coexistence can involve distance, suspicion, violence, avoidance, exchange, imitation, indifference, and kinship all at once. Different populations may have shared landscapes without sharing lives very often. Others may have interacted repeatedly at ecological frontiers. Some contacts likely brought opportunity. Others probably brought danger. The important correction is not that all human groups once lived together peacefully. It is that they lived together at all, and that this fact changes how extinction, survival, and inheritance must be understood. Because once multiple human lineages inhabit the same world, extinction becomes less absolute and more entangled. A lineage can disappear while leaving descendants in another. A population can be demographically overwhelmed while contributing genes useful for survival in the future. A human group can vanish from its own lands and still remain biologically present in populations far away. Denisovans are perhaps the clearest case of this, but they are not the only hint that the human past operated this way. What they do is make the pattern impossible to ignore. They show that the borders between replacement and continuity are often thinner than they appear. There is also a psychological consequence to this wider view. Modern humans are accustomed to imagining themselves as lonely victors at the end of a contest. The Denisovan story suggests something less triumphant and more humbling. We are the survivors. Yes, but we are not untouched survivors. We carry traces of those who did not remain separate. Our history is not a pure line. It is a composite. The singular humanity of the modern world is built partly out of ancient plural humanity. The last branch standing is not a branch that stood entirely alone. That insight may help explain why Denisovans feel so emotionally different from many extinct animals or vanished cultures. They are close enough to unsettle the boundary between self and other. Their disappearance is not safely outside us. It is entangled with our own becoming. They are part of the reason the human story now looks like a history of overlap rather than succession, and once that shift happens, it spreads outward into everything else. Neanderthals are no longer a side rival. They are co-participants in the same network of contact. Other obscure Asian fossils are no longer merely classification problems. They become possible signs of further human diversity. The Ice Age is no longer a background to our emergence. It is a world populated by many humans at once. Scholars still debate the exact number of lineages, the degree of interaction, and the best way to define species boundaries in this tangled past. The evidence remains incomplete, and every new discovery threatens to rearrange the picture again. That uncertainty is not a weakness. It is the honest shape of the field. The old, simpler map was easiest to teach because it ignored how much was missing. The newer map is harder to hold in the mind because it asks us to accept ambiguity, contact, and incomplete separation as normal features of human evolution. Denisovans stand near the centre of that change because they were discovered through the very methods that made such ambiguity visible. So a world of human overlap is not merely a more complicated backdrop for the Denisovan story. It is the real setting of the entire late Pleistocene. Mountains, river valleys, cold caves, and drowned coastal plains were not crossed by one human destiny marching alone. They were shared, disputed, revisited, and inherited by several related kinds of humans whose histories braided together and then narrowed over time. Denisovans help restore that lost plurality. They remind us that the age before written memory was not emptier than history, but fuller. And perhaps that is the most unsettling thing of all. For most of human existence, being human did not mean being the only humans. It meant living in a world where others, close enough to recognize and distant enough to remain separate, also moved through the same cold air, watched the same migrating herds, sought the same shelter, and sometimes crossed the boundary into kinship. The modern condition of singularity is unusual. The Denisovans belong to the older condition, when humanity was still a chorus rather than a solo voice. That chorus is mostly silent now. Most of its members are gone. But once the evidence of overlap is seen clearly, the silence does not feel empty anymore. It feels populated by lost presences, each of them once living, adapting, and encountering one another in ways that helped shape the only human world left. Denisovans are part of that vanished plurality, and through them the ancient past regains its crowdedness. They do not simply tell us who disappeared. They tell us what kind of world disappeared with them, a world in which human beings were never just one thing. If the Denisovan story ended neatly with their discovery, it would already be remarkable enough. A finger bone from Siberia, a hidden lineage, ancient DNA revealing a branch of humanity no one knew was there. But the story refuses to settle. Every few years it seems to become stranger, not because scientists are abandoning caution, but because each new method and each new fragment keeps widening the mystery instead of closing it. Denisovans are no longer just a surprising addition to the family tree. They have become one of the clearest signs that the human past is still far less understood than it appears. One reason the mystery keeps growing is that Denisovans were discovered through genetics before they were known through anatomy. That reversal has consequences. It means science identified the existence of a people before it fully recognized their physical remains, and that leaves a long trail of open questions. Which fossils already found in Asia might belong to Denisovans, which do not? How many Denisovan populations existed? How different were they from one another? Did they all look broadly similar, or were some as distinct from each other as human populations often become when separated across enormous distances and difficult ecologies? The evidence remains incomplete, and because of that incompleteness, every new find has the power to reshape the whole picture. The hybrid child from Denisova Cave remains one of the most startling examples of how strange the picture has already become. A young girl with a Neanderthal mother and a Denisovan father is not simply a scientific curiosity. She is a direct challenge to any tidy narrative of separate human species moving independently through prehistory. Her existence proves that at least some of these lineages met and mixed not only at rare evolutionary margins, but in immediate and recent family terms. She is not the descendant of some ancient and diluted contact lost deep in the past. She is the first-generation child of two different human groups. That one fact changes the texture of the ancient world. The boundaries between lineages were real, but they were lived boundaries, crossed by actual people. And yet even that discovery opens more questions than it answers. Was such mixing rare or more common than the sparse record suggests? Did border regions between Denisovans and Neanderthals regularly produce hybrid populations? Were some Denisovan groups more connected to neighbouring lineages than others? What did such unions mean socially inside their communities? Science can identify ancestry in the genome, but it cannot yet reconstruct the emotional and cultural realities that surrounded those relationships. The result is a record that feels intimate and opaque at the same time. We know just enough to understand that human worlds overlapped in complicated ways, but not enough to narrate those overlaps with confidence. Then there is the growing suspicion that Denisovans were themselves more than one simple thing. Genetic evidence in living populations hints that the Denisovan-related ancestry found in Papuans and other Oceanian peoples may not derive from exactly the same source as the Denisovan-related ancestry found in some East Asian populations. If that interpretation holds, it would suggest not one uniform Denisovan population, but multiple Denisovan-related groups spread across Asia, distinct enough to leave different genetic signatures in later humans. Scholars still debate the best models here, and caution is essential, but the broader pattern is difficult to ignore. Denisovans may turn out to be less like a single hidden tribe, and more like an entire shadow continent of related human populations. This possibility makes Asia's fragmentary fossil record look even more provocative. There are skulls, jaws, teeth, and partial remains from different parts of China and elsewhere in Eastern Asia that have long resisted easy classification. Some seem archaic in one feature and unexpectedly modern in another. Some belong to times and places where Denisovan-related populations might plausibly have lived. Some researchers have cautiously suggested links. Others warn, rightly, that without stronger evidence these associations remain speculative. But the important point is that Denisovans have changed the question itself. Fossils once treated as awkward outliers now invite re-examination in a world where a whole major lineage was hiding in plain sight. New techniques are deepening that re-examination. Ancient protein analysis has already helped identify Denisovan-affiliated remains where DNA did not survive well enough to be recovered. Sedimentary DNA can reveal a human presence in a cave even when no identifiable bone is found. These methods are transforming what counts as evidence. A place once considered silent may now speak chemically. A jaw too old or too warm for DNA may still carry molecular clues in its proteins. As these techniques improve, the human map of Ice Age Asia is likely to become even more complicated. That is one reason the Denisovan mystery feels alive. It is not a solved puzzle sitting behind museum glass. It is an active frontier. There is also the possibility, still debated but deeply intriguing, that Denisovans themselves carry traces of admixture from even older human lineages. In other words, they may have been not only a branch of humanity, but also a kind of archive for deeper branches already mostly lost. If so, then the Denisovan genome is not just the story of one vanished group. It is a layered record of multiple older encounters, some of them perhaps involving populations we have not yet identified clearly in the fossil record. No single explanation fully accounts for every genetic signal being studied, and the field is still moving quickly. But the suggestion alone is enough to widen the horizon. Denisovans may not be the end of the mystery. They may be one doorway into older mysteries still barely visible. That sense of opening rather than closure extends to geography as well. We still do not know the full Denisovan range. We have points on the map: the Altai, the Tibetan Plateau, the indirect genetic trail through Southeast Asia towards Sahul. But between those points lie enormous territories where evidence is missing, ambiguous, or destroyed. Some of the most important Denisovan landscapes may now be underwater beneath seas that rose after the Ice Age. Others may lie in tropical or subtropical regions where bone and DNA rarely survive. In those places, absence becomes hard to interpret. A missing fossil may mean a missing population, or it may mean only that climate and time have been ruthless. What makes the Denisovan mystery especially powerful is that every answer seems to make them both more real and more elusive. We know they existed. We know they were important. We know they met us, mixed with us, and left parts of themselves inside later humans. Yet the more that becomes clear, the more glaring the silences become. Where are their settlements? Where are the fuller bodies? Where are the many other caves that should exist if they were truly widespread? Why do we know their genes better than their faces? Why does such a significant human lineage still hover at the edge of anatomical recognition? Perhaps the best answer is simply that deep time is unfair. It preserves what it happens to preserve, not what later curiosity most wants to see. A single cave in Siberia becomes a revelation because cold sediment guards DNA. Countless other lives vanish because their environments did not. The Denisovan mystery may therefore be strange not because they were uniquely hidden, but because we happened to catch one thread of them before it disappeared entirely. That possibility is both exciting and sobering. If a lineage this important could remain unknown until so recently, what else in the human past remains buried, dissolved, or misidentified? So the mystery grows stranger not because the evidence is collapsing, but because it is accumulating in a way that makes the old boundaries of the story impossible to restore. Denisovans are no longer just a surprise in one cave. They are a sign that human prehistory still contains entire chapters missing from the narrative we inherited. A hybrid child, a plateau jaw, unusual ancestry in living populations, ghost signals in the genome, molecular traces in sediment, and the persistent suspicion of multiple Denisovan worlds instead of one taken together. These do not narrow the enigma, they deepen it. And that may be the most honest place to leave this phase of the story. Denisovans are not a mystery because nothing is known about them. They are a mystery because what is known is too significant to fit the small amount of evidence that survives. They appear again and again in forms that should not be enough a tooth, a protein, a broken bone, a fragment in living DNA, and each time those forms prove capable of carrying far more history than they seem able to hold. In that sense, Denisovans are a lesson in humility. They remind us that the human past is still larger than our categories, and that some of its most important people may still be waiting in the dark, known only by the traces they managed to leave behind. In the end, the Denisovan story settles into a paradox that feels almost too strange to belong to ordinary history. They are gone, and yet they are not entirely gone. Their camps vanished, their dead dissolved into sediment and time, their languages, kinship systems, habits of movement, fears, jokes, rituals, and names all disappeared so completely that not a single memory of them survives in any living tradition we can identify. There is no Denisovan chronicle, no preserved Denisovan face that everyone agrees upon, no surviving community that can say, with direct continuity, we're still here. By every practical standard of historical life, they vanished. And yet part of them remains, not in legend, not in monuments, but in flesh. That is the fact that changes everything. If Denisovans had left only a few strange bones in a Siberian cave, they would still matter as one more unexpected branch of humanity. But because their DNA persists inside living people, they become something far more unsettling and intimate. They force a different understanding of extinction itself. Extinction is no longer a door that simply closes behind the dead. In the human case, sometimes it leaks. Sometimes a vanished people passes fragments of itself into another population and continues there, broken apart, diluted, transformed, but not erased. Denisovans did not survive as Denisovans. They survived as ancestry. This makes them difficult to place emotionally. They are not ancestors in the comforting, linear sense that later societies often imagine. They do not sit neatly at the start of a family line leading cleanly to the present. Nor are they complete strangers, unrelated and safely outside the living world. They occupy an uneasy middle ground. They are close enough to us to have shared children with our species, distant enough to remain largely faceless. They are near enough to have contributed to our biology, far enough to have lost almost everything else. It is precisely this half-presence that makes them linger in the imagination. They are absent and intimate at the same time. There is also a deeper humbling in the Denisovan story. Modern humans often speak, think, and behave as though humanity was always meant to become singular, as though history naturally narrowed toward one surviving form. But the Denisovans remind us that for most of the human past, that was not true. Humanity was once plural. There were other human populations with their own long adaptation, their own place in the land, their own claim to the world. Some were successful for immense spans of time. Some endured climates and landscapes that would challenge us even now. The Denisovans were one of them. They were not a failed rehearsal for us. They were a human reality in their own right. And yet that world of plural humanity narrowed until only one humankind remained in clear continuity. The Denisovans disappeared into that narrowing. Some of them may have died without descendants. Some may have been outnumbered, fragmented, or forced into shrinking refuges. Some crossed the threshold into modern human populations and survived only that way. Their disappearance, like so much in deep time, was probably not one event but many local endings spread across a continent. A lineage once wide enough to leave traces from Siberia to the Tibetan plateau, and in the ancestry of people far to the south and east slowly lost its separate place in the world. That alone would be a profound story. What makes it unforgettable is that the loss is not total. Because their remaining fragments still do something, they are not merely symbolic. Some Denisovan-derived variants helped later humans endure difficult environments. A vanished lineage shaped by cold air, thin air, local pathogens, and regional pressures seems to have passed forward some of its hard-won resilience. This is not mythology. It is a material inheritance. The dead help the living not by being remembered, but by being inherited. It is one of the strangest forms of continuity imaginable. A people can vanish so thoroughly that their face is lost, while their biology continues to work inside descendants who no longer know they carry it. That quiet survival gives the whole story its final emotional weight. Denisovans reveal that the human past is not neatly divided between those who survived and those who did not. There are survivors inside the vanished and vanished people inside the survivors. The line between extinction and continuity, which once seemed sharp, turns out to be blurred by contact, kinship, and time. The old world did not end with clean separations. It bled forward. That may be the truest lesson Denisovans leave behind. Human history, even before history, is cumulative in ways memory cannot track. We carry more of the ancient world than we realize. And perhaps that is why the Denisovans feel less like a solved scientific puzzle than like a lingering presence at the edge of thought. They force modern humanity to look backward and see not emptiness, but company. They remind us that the world once held other kinds of humans who watched the same weather, crossed the same ridges, followed the same herds, and entered the same caves under the same night sky. They did not remain, but neither did they vanish without remainder. Part of them crossed the long darkness of time inside the bodies of those who would outlast them. So the final image is not a ruin, not a skeleton laid out in a museum case, and not even a cave in Siberia. It is something quieter. It is the idea that within living human beings, in fragments too small to feel and too old to remember, a lost branch of humanity still persists, not whole, not named, not visible to the eye, but present. Denisovans are gone as a people. Their world has ended. Their voices are silent. Yet some of what they were continues, scattered through later lives like embers carried far from a fire that no longer burns. In that sense, they did vanish 50,000 years ago, and in another sense, they never quite left. The longer this story is held in the mind, the quieter it becomes. The excitement of discovery fades first. The finger bone, the jaw, the cave, the startling patterns in the genome all settle into something slower and more reflective. What remains is not only the fact that Denisovans existed, or even that their DNA survives in living people. What remains is the feeling of standing at the edge of a much older human world and realizing how little of it was ever guaranteed to stay visible. Somewhere in Ice Age Asia, under skies shaped by cold wind and moving herds, Denisovan children grew up in landscapes their people already knew deeply. They learned paths, seasons, dangers, and shelters. They watched firelight against stone. They listened to voices that are now gone without a trace. They crossed valleys, climbed ridges, breathed thin air, slept through winters, and endured the ordinary demands of being alive in a hard world. For long stretches of time, they were not a mystery. They were simply themselves. Then the long erosion of memory did what it always does. Camps vanished, bodies broke down, landscapes changed, rivers shifted, coasts drowned. Other humans arrived, overlapped, absorbed, and outlasted. The separate world of the Denisovans narrowed until it could no longer be seen clearly in the living world, but it did not disappear completely. That is the strange grace in this story. If grace is the right word for something so accidental and so immense. The past did not keep their names, but it kept a few fragments of their inheritance. Time closed over them, but not perfectly, and perhaps that is enough to leave us with a different sense of the human story. Not a story of a single triumphant line moving cleanly toward the present, but a story of crossings, survivals, losses, and quiet continuities. A story in which disappearance can still leave warmth behind. A story in which the dead are not always separated from the living as completely as we imagine. Denisovans are gone, and yet in another sense they remain where no eye can see them, folded into later bodies, carried forward without memory. So the final image is a cold landscape at dusk, mountain air, a cave mouth dark against stone, snow or dust moving in the wind, a few people passing into shadow, unaware that almost everything about them will be lost, unaware that one tiny part of them will survive longer than anyone could have imagined. The world closes behind them, their footsteps vanish, the silence returns, but not entirely. Deep inside the living, something of that lost world still travels on,